It's great to see all of you. I hope everybody has a good start in this year. It's quite a long break we had, and it's a special pleasure to see you again here, to see you are still engaged and interested in the seminar series. Thank you for that. From my side, just two little notes. Thanks to all of those who sent their feedback. I have to admit, was not from all of you, so all who could send the feedback would be great for us. It just helps us to adjust and to make things better, and maybe to give additional room for meeting, because we also ask, should we open the room in the seminars in half an hour earlier, or those kind of things. So therefore, the feedback from your side wouldn't be bad. And I miss still 3 people on the doodle list. So I guess the 3 people know who is meant. Please don't forget until, because we have to set the date for the dialogue program, because I really hope we can see each other in June or July here in Vienna. This would really be great, seeing that Corona at least will give us a little bit more freedom, especially in the summertime. So it shouldn't be anything difficult to have this dialogue program here in Vienna. And with this, I hand over to Peter, please.
Thank you. I want to say welcome everybody, and I thank our speakers today for supporting us. As you are well aware, there are European tensions that do involve nuclear powers. The significance of the subject we're dealing with does not, sadly, become less. One quick note, please give us feedback. Talk to us. If you have questions, if you feel that we're not, meeting your needs, if you think that something could be addressed that we're not addressing, please let us know. Okay, our door is always open. Okay, now let's get on with it. Thank you. May I please welcome, yes, Jessica Cox. Nice to see you. Thank you. Tarek, are you?
Yep, I'm ready to go.
Good. Okay, let's go.
So welcome everyone. This is the 4th seminar in the study program organized by the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Vienna office and Atomic Reporters. Today's session is Deterrence and Arms Control. As Peter already mentioned, at least here in Europe, tensions are rising. There is some talk of war. Nuclear weapons have not openly been sort of brought into the picture, but of course they're always there. Both strategic nuclear weapons as well as intermediate and shorter range nuclear forces. There used to be a treaty, the 1987 Intermediate and Shorter Range Forces Treaty, that limited these weapons in Europe, but that fell by the wayside. As you know, the United States accused Russia of violating the treaty by deploying a prohibited category of an intermediate range nuclear armed missile. And after that, tensions regarding Ukraine have increased. So we have 4 very capable speakers. In the first part, we will deal with nuclear weapon policy issues. And in the second part, we will be addressing more nuclear arms control and nuclear arms limitation. So I will introduce the speakers in the order that they will speak, and I will introduce each speaker before they speak. So we're very pleased to have our first speaker, Jessica Cox. She serves as Director, Nuclear Policy Directorate at NATO headquarters in Brussels, where she provides policy support on matters related to NATO nuclear deterrence, including to the Secretary General in his role as chair of the Nuclear Planning Group. Ms. Cox also has been previously Director for Arms Control at the National Security Council in Washington, where inter alia she was instrumental in developing a new approach to Russia's violation of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, managing implementation of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or New START, which was extended in February for another 5 years, or rather last month, I should say, February last year, I should say, and restarting bilateral US-Russia strategic stability talks in September 2017. So may I invite Ms. Cox for her presentation?
Great. So hopefully you can hear me. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. That is even more kind given that your next speaker was my boss at the White House during many of those activities, which are attributed to me. But of course, you'll get to hear from John as well. But thank you again for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to try to push some slides so you don't have to watch me the whole time, but can have something a bit more interesting to look at. But despite the fact that we've all been on Zoom for, years now, I'm still not great at it. So let me see if I can actually get this to work. All right. So hopefully you're seeing my presentation. As Tariq said, I'm the Director for Nuclear Policy here at NATO. That means I really manage the full portfolio of NATO's nuclear deterrence policy for the Alliance. I have a counterpart, Wendon Smith, who is responsible for arms control and non-proliferation issues. So I'm not going to tailor my remarks to all of those aspects of our nuclear policy at NATO, but really focus on the deterrence side of things. And I think it's important to remember that nuclear deterrence has really been at the core of NATO's mutual security guarantees and the collective defense of the alliance since its inception over 70 years ago. And heads of state and government continue to reiterate the importance of NATO's nuclear deterrence to the security of the alliance in basically at every opportunity to recall that as long as nuclear weapons exist, NATO will remain a nuclear alliance. But what does this mean in reality? That is what I'm going to highlight for you today. And let's see if I can get the next slide up. There we go. Okay. So, so some of you may have seen a version of this before. This is kind of the basic nuclear deterrence equation. This is what we think of as how do we deter? We have credible capabilities. We have political resolve to use those capabilities if we need to. And then we have effective communications. And hopefully by having all of these three elements, we are able to influence the perceptions of our opponents and have them can make a judgment not to act. And then that makes us successfully deter our adversaries. And I would note that we have a multiplication sign here at the top because it's not about an addition, adding these up, but it's really you have to have all of them. So if any one of these is a zero, it makes our deterrent ineffective. So I'm going to walk through these three elements of our deterrence. So first up is credible capabilities. So these are the pool of nuclear deterrence forces that we think about when we think about NATO's nuclear deterrence. First, you have the strategic forces of the nuclear allies, so the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. These nuclear weapons are the strategic nuclear weapons that that provide the just ultimate guarantee of our security of the alliance. More specifically, and what's kind of outlined in red in the slides, are those forces that we really think about as being under the purview of NATO as an organization. So this is US nuclear weapons deployed forward in Europe. That's the dual capable aircraft that allies maintain. And it's the MPG, which is the nuclear planning group, which is the decision-making body at the ambassador or defense minister level that meets and sets NATO's policies, plans, and exercises and things like that, and manages the mission broadly. And then underlying all of that are nuclear command and control and communications that make our deterrence effective and credible. So next slide. Oh, and I should have said on that slide, there's the reason that there is a dividing line there with France is because France has chosen not to participate in NATO's nuclear deterrence mission. So they maintain the independence of their nuclear forces of, on behalf of the French government, with the French president being the ultimate decision maker. So while they contribute to the security of NATO by having nuclear weapons and nuclear capabilities, they don't participate in the NATO mission and NATO decision-making per se. So what are the DCA, and what does nuclear sharing mean when we talk about it in a NATO context? So a number of allies contribute what we call dual capable aircraft to NATO's nuclear mission. These are the aircraft that would be used in a conflict to carry US nuclear weapons that are forward deployed in Europe. But the reason these are called dual capable aircraft is because their primary role day to day is for regular conventional operations. So allies fly these aircraft for Baltic air policing. We have some now down in the Black Sea region because of the current crisis. So these aircraft day to day have a conventional role and play an important part of our conventional deterrence and defense posture. But then they have an added mission and an added certification for the nuclear mission in times of conflict. And then what we term nuclear sharing is because they would carry US nuclear weapons, but US nuclear weapons are maintained under the full control and custody of the United States up until that very final point in a conflict where we may be called upon to use nuclear weapons. So the US has full custody and control under their responsibilities under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty at all times up until that very final moment. So it's not really sharing of the weapons, it's sharing of the mission. All right. And in addition to kind of our core nuclear sharing arrangements in the DCA mission, we also think of all of the other elements that would support a nuclear mission in a conflict. So these are the conventional capabilities that would support an allied nuclear mission, a NATO nuclear mission, what we call SNOWCAP, which is support of nuclear operations with conventional air tactics, because who doesn't love an acronym? But this element of NATO's nuclear mission really includes potentially all allies to provide this conventional support for nuclear operations in a conflict, and broadens the participation in our nuclear mission to incorporate many more allies in this broader piece of a mission. And this is really important when you think about how we maintain credibility and effectiveness of our forces. We're not just sending, one F-16 to do a mission. It's all of the elements that would go into such a mission, and if we're called to do it, to make sure that we're effective. So that's really the first overview of capabilities. The next piece is resolve or political will. Basically having the political will or resolve to use nuclear weapons if it's ever necessary to do so. And this is it's a bit kind of a looser element, and a bit harder to put concrete pictures in front of, but I've tried to do that here on this slide. These are kind of different ways where we signal resolve, or try to signal our political will and resolve. So first we have exercises or demonstrations of capability, demonstrating that we have the credible capabilities and we have the ability to take action should we be required to do so. Second, we have political statements and participation in the nuclear mission. So burden sharing across all NATO allies, not just the mission or the capabilities, but the decision-making, the policy-making, having this be integrated into our broader thinking, nuclear deterrence integrated into our broader thinking as part of the alliance. And this sends a strong signal when we're able to demonstrate unity, that there is political will and that we are prepared should we be called upon to do so. Finally, we have what I put here as kind of doctrine and policy statements. This is actually kind of where we would say what we would and wouldn't do. For instance, here we have pictured the strategic concept, which is kind of the top level strategic guidance for the alliance, and it sets the policy over a number of years and the strategic direction for NATO. And in the 2010 strategic concept, we outlined that even in this post-Cold War world, deterrence, quote, deterrence based on an appropriate mix of nuclear and conventional capabilities remains a core element of our overall strategy. So signaling that deterrence is still part of NATO's deterrence and its overall posture. And so some of the types of things, the slide's called declaratory policy, but it's a bit different than what we think about from the US perspective with declaratory policy. But it's basically just outlining in these strategic documents, in our summit communiques, the types of circumstances and thinking behind why NATO's nuclear deterrence remains important and relevant, and outline some of the considerations that we have when thinking about our nuclear deterrence. And so this is another way where we signal that political will and that resolve. For instance, the allies have said, and heads of state have said, that the fundamental purpose of NATO's nuclear forces is to preserve peace, prevent coercion, and to deter aggression. So our real aim is deterrence and to restore deterrence and to prevent escalation in a crisis. And then another one that I'll draw your attention to is also that nuclear weapons, kind of in the middle of the slide there, that nuclear weapons are unique, and that any employment of nuclear weapons would fundamentally alter the nature of the conflict. So these are some of the types of policies that we use to signal our political will. Slide here. And then the third kind of example of this is participation and burden sharing. So I already talked a little bit about the nuclear planning group, which is the senior decision-making body for all of NATO's policy and posture questions. And it has the participation of all allies, except for France, who, as I mentioned, has decided not to participate. And this is really about sharing the burden of the political responsibility and the political risks and the decision-making for NATO's nuclear mission. And I should highlight that the NPG has an even more unique role than our kind of normal North Atlantic Council meetings or our defense ministerials, as we have one ongoing right now, because NATO does not delegate any responsibilities for the mission to our military authorities. So all decision-making, all taskings, everything has to be approved by the NPG and the political level, both in peacetime and in times of crisis. So the NPG has even more responsibilities for the full nuclear mission here at NATO, both in peacetime, crisis, and in conflict. And then this third element of our deterrence equation is what we call effective communications. So how do we communicate capability and resolve to make sure that our potential adversaries are being deterred, and then of course our publics are being reassured and allies are being reassured. This is a really sensitive area for many of our allies. There is a lot of debates, as you probably know, within European nations in particular, but also in North America about domestic debates that about the continued salience of nuclear weapons. There's a significant nuclear ban movement, as evidenced by the treaty for prohibition of nuclear weapons that came into force a few years ago. So allies think about communications about our NATO's nuclear mission in very sensitive ways. And this is a very difficult topic for a number of allies, how we communicate and what we say. But I would highlight that communications is not just about going out and signaling strength and we're strong and we have all this, great capabilities. It's also about ensuring transparency, both in peace, particularly in peacetime, about our activities, our exercises, our policies, so that if we're in a crisis, if we're in a conflict, that there's no misperception or miscalculation about our what we're doing that could lead to unintended escalation or increased tensions in times of crisis. So it's not just about signaling strength; it's also about being transparent and being normalizing what we're doing, so that we're sending appropriate and effective signals in crisis and conflict. As we've looked at our NATO communications, I think that this slide kind of highlights why communications is so important. So let me break this down a little bit. So my office, working in coordination with our public diplomacy office, has commissioned in 2019 an analysis of our information environment on nuclear deterrence. So the blue communications, the line that you see there at the bottom, is how much we, NATO allies, and press of NATO nations communicated messages about nuclear deterrence in 2019, particularly things that were picked up on social media, but also in regular press. So the blue line are things that are our own communications about our messages that are complementary to or explanatory of our policies. The red line is how much hostile communications were out in the information domain, particularly Russian direct communications and Russian affiliated press. So this is what Russia was communicating about nuclear deterrence, hostile to NATO in the same time frame. So now, whether or not you support a more robust nuclear posture or want to ban all the nuclear weapons out there, I think this is actually quite a troubling slide and a troubling picture, because it means that we're not doing a good job putting our messages out into the information domain, which, as I said before, means that we may not be clearly communicating what we're doing, why we're doing it, and it potentially increases the chance of misinterpretation or miscalculation as a security situation would intensify. So it's not just about whether we're saying good things about deterrence or bad, but it's making sure our voice is being heard, so that we're able to provide those effective messages. And then again, as part of our information and our efforts to try to understand our information environment, we actually undertook polling, specific polling on nuclear deterrence in a number of NATO countries over the past couple of years. And so this is kind of a summary of one of the questions that we looked at. So as you can see here, how important do you consider the possession of nuclear weapons by some NATO countries to your country's security? And I think the results here are pretty clear that actually a majority of NATO people, the populations, actually do think that it is quite important or fairly important, and that we maintain our nuclear deterrence posture. But what was one of the more interesting questions, and it gets back to effective communications, is that when we factored out that group at the bottom that says, I don't really know much about nuclear weapons over all the data, what we got was this, which is about a 7% increase overall in the number of people who thought that considered possession of nuclear weapons important for security. So people who said that they knew more about deterrence or security or NATO, when we just looked at that cohort, their support for NATO's nuclear posture and for our deterrence actually increased. And then the people that said they didn't know a lot, they were tended to be the ones who thought it wasn't very important or not important at all. So, and we saw this across all nations that we polled, and across kind of all the various questions that we asked. So it was a really interesting finding that when people thought they were more educated and understood the issues more, they actually tended to be more supportive of our current thinking and posture. And so finally, I just wanted to kind of end on why does nuclear deterrence matter anymore at all? You know, most people think about nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence as being, you know, a relic of the Cold War, something that you know, the Soviets and the United States did, you know, 50 years ago, and now we have AI and, you know, sophisticated hypersonic missiles and all these other things. Why should we even, you know, have nuclear weapons at all? Why do we need deterrence? And so, you know, I think from a NATO standpoint, of course, our overall end state and desire is a world without nuclear weapons. And that is reiterated by heads of state and has been over the past decade. But unfortunately, we're not in a security environment right now where that's possible. So here, I mean, I think most of you are probably tracking the current security situation with Russia. But as we, most of the attention's been focused on their conventional buildup around Ukraine and in Belarus. But there's also really a significant nuclear dimension to what Russia is doing right now as well. Over the past 2 months, just in the open source press, we've seen Russia conduct a number of strategic bombing runs, including simulated launches against NATO nations of their new Kinzhal hypersonic air-launched ballistic missile. We're seeing that we saw them delay their strategic nuclear forces exercise, which usually takes place in October. And Russian press reports say that it will probably take place within the next week as this kind of conventional, to coincide with the conventional buildup in and around Ukraine. We are seeing deployments of its strategic submarines in the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. And these are not only submarines that have strategic nuclear weapons, but also have their dual capable intermediate range cruise missile caliber carrying submarines. And we're potentially going to see additional launches of their Zircon hypersonic sea-launched cruise missiles. We saw quite a number of tests in December, including salvo launches and submarine launches. And so Russia's clearly using not just its traditional conventional forces, but also its nuclear, both tactical and strategic nuclear forces, to send us some signals about coercion and to try to make sure that that they are clear that if we engage militarily, we're likely to be facing not just a conventional crisis, but also potentially a nuclear crisis as well. So we do have, it's not just about tanks and battle groups, it's also about nuclear posture as well. And we've even seen that in some of Russia's press statements where they're calling on, using nuclear rhetoric to highlight the importance of Ukraine and maintaining control over Ukraine as part of their posturing. So nuclear weapons still relevant from a Russia perspective, which means we still have to think about them from a NATO perspective as well, even as we seek dialogue and arms control in the future. So with that, I'll just leave you there with Michael Quinlan, one of the big UK strategic thinkers throughout the Cold War and post-Cold War period. And I look forward to your questions and our discussion.
Thank you very much, Jessica. That was a very clear and concise presentation that explained NATO's posture and policy very well. So floor is now open for questions from our participants. If you raise your hand, Alexander will admit you and you can put up your comment or question to Jessica. Claire.
Hello. Hello. I have two questions because I'm not sure that you can answer the first. So I hope I'm looking at the wrong screen. So I hope that that's okay. My first question is, can you discuss the relationship that may or may not exist between the US government and NATO in determining the strategic concept going forward, given that this year is also a year where the Biden administration will be doing their nuclear posture review in order to make sure that there are no gaps or sort of weird overlaps? And if you can't answer that question, or if there's just really nothing to say to it, can you talk a little bit more about the data that you'd expressed on page 10, that slide with the us versus them sort of information? And can you tell us if any of that data had a qualitative review as opposed to quantitative? Because, for example, a lot of Russian bots are super obvious and thus they're not very effective. So just because they have more, it doesn't necessarily do the same. And so I was hoping maybe you can comment to that. Thank you.
Should I answer or wait for roundup questions and take them all?
We'll see if there are a couple more. Anyone else?
Tariq, I see three people. I see Janice, I see Daniyar, and I see Francisco with hands raised.
Very good.
I think Janice was the first.
All right. Yeah, I can start. Thank you so much, Mrs. Cox, for the very interesting remarks. So my question is on the nuclear planning group. How much do you think a country or the influence of a country is determined within the group by whether the country is participating in nuclear sharing or not?
Alexander, we'll take one more and then we'll revert to Jessica.
Okay, then I would say Danya is next.
Hi, thank you so much. I have just one question. You use the words nuclear rhetoric in the press. I would really like if you could provide just a couple of examples, if I could read them. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So three very good questions. Over to you, Jessica.
Great, those are great questions. And I'll just go through in order. So the relationship between the strategic concept and the NPR. Interestingly, back in 2010, which was the last time NATO updated its strategic concept, it was also an NPR year for the Obama administration. So this is not a new concept for us. So the NPR should come out first. I'm not in the US government, so I don't know exactly what the current status is, other than what the US has been consulting allies, which is that it is nearing completion and there are just a few decisions left for the president. But we are expecting the NPR to come out in the next month or two. The strategic concept is currently being drafted by the private office, by the Secretary General's staff. It will go to all allies for negotiation later this spring, and then it will be agreed by heads of state at the summit in Madrid this summer. So they're on different timelines, which is helpful. So we will know what the US NPR says before the strategic concept is completed, probably even before it enters real negotiations between all the allies. So there'll be, obviously from a US perspective, they'll want to make sure these documents are harmonized, and I'm sure their negotiations in committees and at the NAC will reflect that view. But what I would say more broadly for the strategic concept, it's not just about mirroring what the US does and what their declaratory policy or what their capabilities are, right? Because we have 3 nuclear allies, and our strategic concept is a document for all of NATO. So we have to not only take into account US nuclear policy, but also have to look at UK and French policies and posture, and then also, again, kind of what we say overall and how we think about deterrence from an alliance perspective. So we'll be balancing a lot of these considerations as the document is drafted. You know, I don't know if we'll see big changes from the US or not, but I don't think we'll see big changes from NATO. So I think, you know, regardless of what the US does, there may be some tweaks that we need to think about or things like that. But I think from a NATO perspective, we have, you know, as I put up on the slide before, a fairly ambiguous policy. We like it that way. Allies like it that way for a reason. We have different responsibilities. We have 30 allies. We have 3 nuclear allies. So we're balancing a lot more in our strategic concept. I would also note that the strategic concept is going to be very high level. So we only expect to have you know, a few sentences on nuclear deterrence in the document overall. So we'll really focus on those things that are very critical for us to explain publicly and as we move forward. So that's kind of how we're looking at it right now. But we'll see how it unfolds as we get clarity on the NPR. On the qualitative, quantitative results on page 10, yes, this is one snapshot from a much larger and actually multi-year assessment that we've done on our information environment. So what we have, and we did some targeting look at specific nations too, which I can't share publicly because it's internal data. But what we saw is that Russian media and Russian themes and Russian surrogates, so even you know, German officials that are basically taking the Russian party line, those messages penetrated much better in allied media than allied messages. And so maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. From my perspective, it's bad because I rather, you know, allied media talk about allied policies and positions much more than Russian lines. But we did see a much higher and, you know, well over statistical significance penetration of Russian themes and messages on nuclear issues than we did NATO. So that you know, and kind of this data has really helped us as we've sought to enhance and more effectively calibrate our messaging. Because again, we don't want to be out there being like, yay, nukes, they're great, they're awesome. That's not really our position either, right? So it's about calibrating your message. It's about making sure that we're not putting escalatory messages out, but that we are putting messages out to enhance people's understanding of what our policies and posture are. You know, we've done a lot of work to try to declassify some things that were formerly kept very close hold, like details on our nuclear exercises, so that it's more transparent and it's seen for what it is, which is a very small, very focused exercise that's not against any particular adversary. So, I mean, we've really tried to use this information environment assessment and the data that it showed to really focus in on some key areas of education. And that's what I think what it showed us more than anything is we don't want to penetrate the same way that the Russians do. We don't want to be as loud and as noisy. We never will be. But we do want to focus on doing those things that enhance our credibility and reassure allies in particular that NATO has a safe, secure, and effective deterrence. So that's a lot of what we've done with our information and with our assessments, and as we've looked at polling data and trying to understand our environment more broadly. To Janice's question on nuclear sharing and whether being kind of in the nuclear club gives you a bit more influence, I would say yes and no. I think that the allies that have responsibility for and participate in NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements they take a bigger role in the committee. They understand the mission more, they participate more, they drive policies more, and other allies that don't participate, in some cases, not all, tend to defer to them quite a bit in our committees and as we're doing policy development. So while we don't have kind of a formal, separate line of decision making for whether you're part of NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements or not, and every ally that sits in the NPG has the same, one man, one vote. We do operate fully as a consensus-based organization. But I would say that the DCA allies, just because they participate in the nuclear mission, their voice carries a greater weight with their peers. And so there's certainly, I think, informal influence that they have, also the US and UK, of course, that non-participating allies don't have that same, their voice doesn't carry that same weight with their peers. So I do think that there is informally some of that, but not in a formal way. And then finally, to the question on nuclear rhetoric, some good recent examples that we've seen just over the last few weeks is, I think it was Shoigu, the defense minister, who likened the crisis to the current crisis to the Cuban Missile Crisis, invoking kind of the nuclear standoff and the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Putin has said several times that maintaining their position on Ukraine is an existential issue for Russia, which is language that is in their nuclear deterrence doctrine, their public nuclear deterrence doctrine from 2020, about the types of scenarios in which nuclear weapons would be considered. They've been, kind of making, obviously, kind of moving the exercise quite publicly was part of that. They had Putin's remarks about after the Zircon hypersonic missile launches in December, where he basically said this is going to give them, overwhelming capabilities to, that it'll make NATO, kind of take a second look or something like that. I mean, they're tying nuclear rhetoric and nuclear language, and they're signaling their nuclear posture as part of this current crisis. And so, they're not out there saying, yet, we're going to escalate to nuclear war if you support Ukraine, but they're also relying on language that is their nuclear language, right? That is the language that they put out there in talking about the crisis and the importance of Ukraine in particular. So, and then of course in their statements around the treaties and some of the elements that they highlighted in the two treaty proposals, directly call for an end to NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements and the redeployment of nuclear weapons out of Europe. So, and they've discussed that publicly for a long time. So yeah, so hopefully that helps.
Mhm. Thanks, Jessica. We started a few minutes late, so we will take this final round. I see 4 hands, and Alexander, you can, or 5 hands. Alexander, you can decide in which order to admit them. Can you please keep your questions short? Because we also want to hear from John Woolstall afterwards. So Alexander, over to you to admit the questioners.
Yes, I think we go by first come, first served, and start with Francisco, then Maren and David, please.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it'll be very brief. So we know there's a prohibition on the use of force in the UN Charter, but also the threat to use force. And I was wondering if nuclear deterrence counts as a threat to use force, because I don't believe having standing armies or even military alliances counts as a threat necessarily. But if you have the political resolve and you signal that resolve with effective communications, like you said, doesn't that turn into a threat to use force? That is the question. Is it the same to effectively communicate the resolve and to threaten to use force?
Hi, and thanks, Jessica, for the interesting talk. Good to see you again. I have lots of questions, but I'm limiting myself to one, which is hard. You mentioned the posture review upcoming, the strategic concept, but we also have the NPT-REFCON and the first meeting of states parties upcoming this year. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the field of tension of being NATO member and NPT member, commitment to disarmament versus deterrence. That would be great. Thanks.
Great. I'll also be very, very quick. I mean, we've been speaking a lot about Russia. In one of our previous seminars, we also talked a bit about the Chinese nuclear buildup that's been happening. And we've talked also a bit about the fact that there's an established sort of terminology, a shared language between Russia and the West, the US and NATO about nuclear deterrence, but there isn't so much one with China. So I'm just wondering what's NATO's stance on the increased Chinese nuclear buildup, as well as is NATO working to establish dialogue with the Chinese government on nuclear deterrence? Thank you.
I actually wanted to ask pretty much the same thing as David in regards to China, and further than that also, if you consider China to be an additional threat in the Ukraine crisis and if they would intervene in terms of nuclear deterrence.
Okay, Jessica.
And we also have Leah, one more.
Yeah, I just wonder, can one more question, is that okay? And then I think we close the round.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. My question is on AR-KAS and the impact that it's had on the NATO relationship, especially as you mentioned that Trident is considered like critical to the shared capability, especially in regards to the impact on France as a member state that's outside of the shared NATO nuclear strategy, and whether it's encouraged France to integrate further into it, or if it's had like the opposite effect and is cementing France's position outside of the wider group. Thank you.
So Jessica, if you could give brief answers, that would be very great. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I'll try. On Francisco's question about the UN Charter and signaling resolve, I mean, I think this is something we do. This is not just a nuclear deterrence issue. This is a conventional deterrence issue as well. And I would say no. I mean, NATO is very clear that we are a defensive alliance, and we certainly, have no desire or intention to use any of our capabilities, conventional or nuclear, offensively, unless we feel like we have to in defense of the alliance. So we are very clear on that. And I think signaling our resolve to use nuclear weapons, if we're called upon, if we have to do so to reestablish deterrence, is not the same thing as threatening to use force at all. In fact, hopefully it will prevent the use of force by reinforcing the deterrence calculus. On the disarmament versus deterrence thinking here, I would just say, NATO, as I mentioned before, is very much committed to arms control and disarmament. Since the end of the Cold War, we have reduced the number of nuclear weapons in Europe by about 90%. So we have basically, right now within NATO, within the kind of NATO bucket, kind of what we see as our minimum credible deterrence to maintain our posture. And certainly we're looking for other opportunities to further reduce our reliance on nuclear weapons, but when the security environment provides for it. And so it's very much our thinking is based on about the prevailing security environment. We will not undertake unilateral reductions outside the purview of a treaty. But that being said, allies are very committed to the NPT. They see it as kind of the fundamental framework for non-proliferation and disarmament. We had a strong statement when we thought the NPT was going to be last year. We'll continue to have strong statements along those lines this year. And I would say allies are very concerned about the state of the global nuclear trends. Basically the nuclear weapons are trending up, and gets to the next question on China as well. But they're trending up in basically every nuclear declared country in the world, from North Korea and China to India and Pakistan. And so, that is a trouble, and obviously Russia. So that is troubling, and it does mean that, we're not really in a position where we can undertake further disarmament right now, but we are allies are very interested in arms control, and certainly support US efforts with Russia to further arms control and encourage Russia to join the US in doing arms control as well. On China, we have been looking much more at China over the last 6 to 8 months. I think allies are very concerned not just about their nuclear weapons developments, but also their broader military developments and posture in Asia. Two allies are Asia Pacific nations as well, the US and Canada, and the UK and France and Denmark and Norway. Many others have this interest in, or the Danes have interest in the region, and so we do follow developments very closely. I think right now we feel like NATO's deterrence posture vis-a-vis China is sufficient. It's still a lesser included case from a Russia standpoint. We don't think that China is actively seeking to target European NATO with its nuclear weapons capabilities, but we are very worried about the direction of travel and the potential changes in their nuclear doctrine, their potential fielding of more strategic systems that seem to be for not just regional deterrence, but more global deterrence. And so these are things that we will follow very closely in the coming months and years. And as part of that, we are also actively trying to encourage China to consider arms control, but more likely transparency and risk reduction measures. We have a standing dialogue through my colleagues in our political arm that have regular talks with Chinese counterparts. But much like in other forums, the Chinese have been pretty hesitant, or between hesitant and outright rejecting any discussions, particularly on nuclear arms control or transparency at this time. So, but allies raise it with China in their bilateral discussions, and NATO does collectively as well. And then just finally on AUKUS, I think, this really hasn't changed things much from my perspective, from a nuclear deterrence perspective. And I don't really think it's changed alliance dynamics within NATO very much at all, frankly. Certainly, bilateral tensions between France and several of the other countries in NATO are always, kind of go up and down. There's, NATO is an alliance of 30 allies that are not always in lockstep. And and tensions amongst them go up and down and all the time, depending on what's going on in the world. So, but I think, you know, the US and France have had several dialogues bilaterally to kind of move through this, but it hasn't really impacted any of our work. I would say in general, France and the MPG, the people who work nuclear policy in France, they probably wouldn't like it if I said it, but they want to be inside and want to do the nuclear stuff here at NATO. And then but the broader policy has been the policy since France got its nuclear arsenal back in the 1950s or 60s, I guess, that they will maintain the independence of their nuclear deterrent. And Macron just reiterated that in 2020. But allies are always supportive of French participation and welcome it.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica, for taking the time to talk to us today. You gave us an excellent presentation and an excellent account of NATO thinking on nuclear weapons. We'll wait to see what comes in the new strategic concept in June at the Madrid summit. And I also took note that NATO continues to support the NPT and, of course, at the end stage would like a world free of nuclear weapons. So thank you very much. And now it's my pleasure to introduce a friend of longstanding, John Woolstall, who is Senior Advisor at Global Zero, a multi-stakeholder international initiative for nuclear disarmament, which was set up by a common friend, Bruce Blair, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago. Bruce Blair was a launch control officer responsible for launching US intercontinental ballistic missiles, and after leaving the force, he became a leading exponent of nuclear risk reduction and reducing the dangers from just relying on prompt launch of nuclear weapons, and I'm sure John will address that. From 2014 to 2017, John Woolstall served as Special Assistant to former US President Barack Obama and was Senior Director for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation at the National Security Council. Not only that, he also served as the special advisor to then US Vice President John Biden for nuclear security and non-proliferation, and as director for non-proliferation at the National Security Council. So John, good to see you again, and over to you.
Thanks, Tariq. Before I start, what's the logistics here? We're 15 minutes over. What time should I stop speaking to make sure there are questions?
Well, we'll give you 10 minutes more, and so you can go up till about 5:25 or so.
Okay, that's fine. I just want to know how you want to handle the schedule.
Yeah, is 25 enough for you?
It's fine. I can talk in 5, but I just so that's fine. I'll be brief.
And then you can pick up in the questions, and we'll give you the full 45 in any case.
It's fine. I just want to know how to plan it, Tariq. That's fine. Thanks.
Great.
So let me start by saying thanks to Jessica. So one of the few smart things I did in government was hire Jessica to handle a big part of the US-Russia strategic and tactical nuclear set of issues. And you could see her depth of knowledge really on display as she helps explain sort of the NATO perspective. I'm not in government, and I'm not bound by all of the bureaucratic requirements of speaking for an alliance with 30 members. So I'll be a bit more direct and a bit more blunt. Look, there's a lot of history here. The nuclear landscape in Europe goes back to the end of World War II, the United States, which ended the World War in Japan by dropping 2 nuclear weapons on Japan and immediately introducing the nuclear question into Europe as it sought to keep Stalin and the Soviet Union at bay. And that undercurrent continues unabated to this day. It has ebbed and flowed, particularly in the period from 1991 until arguably 2009, 2010, a little bit later with then the illegal annexation of Crimea. But nuclear weapons and the role that they can and continue to play day by day are just a reality of that history. And so as you cover these issues, it's really valuable to keep that in mind. So for example, as long as the United States has had nuclear weapons, it has threatened to use them first in a conventional crisis if necessary. So Jessica's right. I mean, there's no question that Russia has been talking and seeking to use the threat of nuclear weapons as a way to hold NATO at bay and often to divide NATO. But it is the United States who first championed the potential use for nuclear weapons in response to conventional attack during the 1950s, when we were absolutely convinced that the Soviet Union had conventional superiority. So even to this day, the United States holds out the right to use nuclear weapons first in a crisis. And while we see ourselves and we see NATO as the good guys, Russia clearly doesn't see us as the good guys, views itself as being surrounded by American and NATO conventional and often nuclear superiority. And so this dynamic is one that often is left out of the NATO perspective. It's not to say that NATO's at fault. It's to say, as my mother used to, that it takes two to tango, and that the United States and NATO are part of this arms race dynamic, which broke loose in the Obama administration when Russia was violating a number of arms control treaties. And we're seeing accelerating now, both in Russia, in Europe, and in East Asia with China. And we can talk a little bit about that in the Q&A if you want to. So what are the role of nuclear weapons today in NATO, and do they play in the Ukraine crisis? I would say that there are two important storylines here that are worth keeping in mind as you look at the current crisis. The first is that nuclear weapons have been a part of the Ukraine story since it was liberated from Soviet occupation in 1991. It was born nuclear. In 1991, there were over 1,400 strategic nuclear weapons left on Ukrainian territory, which the United States and Russia agreed belonged to Russia, but were in the physical possession of Ukraine, and which Ukraine said belonged to them. And so there was a very difficult 3-year period where the United States led, working cooperatively with Boris Yeltsin's Russia, to convince Ukraine that those weapons should be returned to Russia so that Ukraine would not become the world's 3rd largest nuclear weapon state. That was by no means easy, nor was it ever assured until the last nuclear weapon left Ukraine in 1996. The United States and Russia and the UK had to negotiate an agreement called the Budapest Memorandum, I'm sure a number of you are familiar with, which said that the 3 countries will respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine, that they remain committed to the existing international orders as established by the Helsinki process and OSCE, and Russia has blatantly violated those commitments. There's an argument about whether the United States or United Kingdom were obligated to do more than just stand up and say, we think this is a problem. This was not an agreement that was ever ratified or approved by the legislatures in either country. It was more a political statement, but it's one that raises the question of whether Ukraine made the right or wrong decision in giving up 1,400 nuclear weapons, because it would have served by now likely as either a cause for war, where Russia would have gone to war to reclaim those weapons, or as a very potent deterrent so that Russia would never even think of invading Ukraine. And the sentiment now in Ukraine is one very strongly of, boy, was that a big mistake to give up this capability, because we're basically being salami sliced to death. This is not to say that the United States is wrong and Russia was right or Ukraine was stupid. It's simply to say that this is already tinged with a nuclear component that in the minds of Ukraine, in the minds of many in the United States, and in the minds of Russia, has to be factored into the future of Ukraine and the future of this crisis, because it definitely matters for the future of efforts to convince other countries not to develop nuclear weapons, including in Europe. Now, the second component is the reality that the United States and Russia both maintain significant nuclear capabilities, both in and around the region, and strategic nuclear capabilities capable of destroying each other in 30 minutes or less. And both sides have formal doctrines which say the following: you can't control escalation, we control escalation, which of course is a fantastic recipe for uncontrolled escalation by both countries. The United States and NATO believe that they're acting in a very conservative, restrictive way. I actually believe that to be the case. The United States doesn't often talk about its nuclear weapons or its nuclear capabilities in Europe. The reality is, and you'll find military officers will tell you this, nuclear weapons in Europe are political weapons. They are not military weapons. They are unlikely to be able to penetrate Russian airspace. We use them as a way of integrating the alliance around a shared capability, that we are all in this, and that should an attack come, there is ambiguity about how the United States will respond. Many in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, view that as a positive. They specifically wanted to join NATO because it was a nuclear alliance. And so even countries in Europe that say, we don't need these things, they're expensive. They remind our population that we're threatening first nuclear use. We could be using this money for either conventional capabilities or other things that are much better at deterring Russia. It's very hard to get an alliance that operates by consensus to pull back on its nuclear obligations. And so Jessica's exactly right that NATO relies on ambiguity, even when that can feed into the risk of escalation. And there's a debate in the United States about whether we should be more specific and less ambiguous about nuclear weapons use in order to prevent escalation. And I can tell you that President Biden, at least when he was vice president, was very concerned about this dynamic. He's already mentioned his concern that should US and Russian troops come into interaction in Ukraine, that could lead to escalation and even to nuclear war. He said that's why Americans should get out of Ukraine now, because in a conflict, we are not going to be able to go in and get them. So there is an underlying nuclear component here that both states have a responsibility for. Now, it was ironic, if you looked at Jessica's slides, the mentions about nuclear rhetoric, that there were 140 blue mentions and about 2,800 red mentions. Ironically, that's about the same level of nuclear weapons in both countries. The United States unofficially has about 140, 150 nuclear weapons still in Europe. Russia has about 2,000 to 3,000 battlefield tactical nuclear weapons at its disposal deployed on the margins of Europe. And so that gives you a sense on how much each country relies on battlefield nuclear weapons. The United States really doesn't have that many because we don't think there are really tactical uses of nuclear weapons, that the use of a nuclear weapon would be an unprecedented strategic development, whereas Russia continues to believe that it can potentially use the threat of nuclear weapons and even limited nuclear strikes in order to terminate a crisis or a conflict on terms that it considers favorable. It is ironic when you consider that both countries were part of a P5 statement just a month ago, which said that a nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. But in fact, both countries plan every day for the potential use of nuclear weapons in a conflict. Both countries want to be able to prevail in that conflict. And NATO actively plans for the potential use of nuclear weapons through nuclear sharing, through dual capable aircraft, and through snowcats, as Jessica laid out. So that's probably all that I really wanted to get into. I'm happy to answer questions, specifically about what's either going on in Ukraine or some of the history here. What I would say in closing is that, I've now been working on these issues for about 40 years. I started when I was a teenager in New York City. There's been remarkably little change in the underlying dynamics. There is a sense, and I'm picking on Jessica here because she, of course, had to speak for NATO, but there's a nice slide she showed with the calculation for deterrence, as if threatening to use nuclear weapons, which would kill hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, can be sort of synthesized down into a process. And the reality is that nuclear weapons are as reliable as the human beings which have to make decisions about their potential use. And Tariq mentioned my former boss, Bruce Blair, who was very aware that the frailties and the fallibility of human beings were baked into the nuclear process. And again, I'm picking on Jessica, but her last quote by Sir Michael Quinlan, which said, it's better to have nuclear weapons and no war than war and no nuclear weapons. Well, actually, the worst is to have a war with nuclear weapons. And every day when we wake up, the people with nuclear weapons roll the dice on our behalf. And they think that it works because it's worked so far. And it will work until it fails. But when it fails, it will fail spectacularly. There is no built-in fail-safe to the use of nuclear weapons. There is a probability that they will be used based on what you think about human dynamics. And right now, Vladimir Putin believes clearly that he can weaponize risk and that NATO will be the ones to back down. But when it becomes a test of wills, and as American and NATO troops come into close proximity, or even in conflict with Russians, there's a higher probability that those bulwarks, those safeguards will fail, especially when you combine it with the proclivity of the United States and Russia to target things like early warning, command and control, and communications, which are used by both countries not only to control conventional capabilities, but nuclear capabilities. So should we get into a conflict and Russia tries to take down America's conventional or NATO's conventional early warning network, how are we to know that that's not a prelude to a nuclear attack? that that's not designed to take out our nuclear capabilities, and vice versa. And we don't have the experience with each other over the last 20 years as these new technologies come into play to understand what the signaling really is. One person's offensive threat is another person's signal that they want to de-escalate. And unless we actually engage with each other more constructively and more consistently, the risks of an unintended or undesired escalation go up. So on that cheery note, I'll be happy to take on any questions or discussions you might be interested in.
Well, thank you very much, John. Since we still have a few more minutes in this section, you recently wrote an article in War on the Rocks on no first use and sole purpose of nuclear weapons. And people believe that President Obama during his time in the last year was thinking about this, and Vice President or Joe Biden, when campaigning for president, actively talked about no first use. So could you combine those two and in 3 or 4 minutes say a little bit about that as well?
Sure. The piece actually was in the Washington Post, not the War on the Rocks. War on the Rocks, unfortunately, decided to publish people that supported the insurrection, and so I no longer view that as a valuable outlet. President Biden, when he was candidate, said that he supported adopting a sole purpose statement, that the only reason the United States has or should have nuclear weapons is to deter the use of nuclear weapons by others, and if necessary, to respond to them. He made that statement when he was vice president. He said he and President Obama believed that there were no conceivable scenarios where the United States would have to use nuclear weapons first. And as a candidate, he supported that more nuanced formulation of sole purpose, because the possibility of adopting a no first use statement does put the United States in direct contrast with where the British and where the French are, and particularly where the Eastern European countries, the Baltics and Poland, believe the NATO alliance should be. And sole purpose provides a little bit more ambiguity and would avoid the argument. I don't know where the NPR is going to come out. My belief is that both the president and the Secretary of State continue to believe on the merits that sole purpose is a perfectly fine and in fact a better posture for the United States to be in. But of course, the reality is that when you're in government and are responsible for these things, then the political pressures and the diplomatic pressures often become a major influence. And also you have the people responsible for nuclear planning at the Pentagon who are concerned about China's increased reliance on nuclear weapons, saying, well, this is not really the time to be pulling back on our nuclear commitments. I think what it really gets down to, Tariq, is after 4 years of Donald Trump, and before that, before Obama, 8 years of George Bush, NATO no longer implicitly trusts the United States and their commitments. And at the top level, for the United States to do anything which could be argued, even inherently if I think it's not credible, but would be argued that this is pulling back on America's commitment to NATO, I think it's going to be very difficult for the United States to adopt that posture. In reality, I would make the substantive argument that saying we are committed to doing the things that we say we're going to do and not making empty threats like, oh yeah, we're going to use nuclear weapons first, actually enhance American credibility. But because the United States has told European allies for 70 years, don't worry about a conventional war because we could always use nuclear weapons, it's very hard to pull back on that quickly. And so I think there's going to be some long-term goal, or we still seek to adopt a sole purpose, but the conditions aren't quite right yet. That's my guess.
Okay, thank you very much. So floor is open for questions, and Alexander, over to you for managing the order, please.
Okay, no questions. Ah, yes, Declan, would you please? And then Christian and David again.
Hi, so yeah, thanks for the talk and for allowing me to ask a question. So mine is going to be on Ukraine. I've seen as the debate online is about Ukraine giving way to nuclear weapons and how it may or should or should not have kept them. I've seen some dismiss the suggestion that they could have by saying that they wouldn't have been capable. It would have been very difficult for them capabilities wise in terms of economically, infrastructure and the scientific expertise. So I'd just like to know if that's really the case, that they were not capable of keeping them or would have struggled significantly. Thank you.
Christian, please.
Yeah, thank you. My question relates to nuclear weapons in Europe. and the US policy in the future. As you mentioned, in the beginning, the US brought nuclear weapons in Europe in this doctrine of massive retaliation. Basically, it was cost effective. Then more troops were deployed, and in a multipolar world, or in this simultaneity with China and Russia, is there a possibility for US to decide that we'll keep in check one of those two, China or Russia, with this kind of massive retaliation because it's more cost effective, for example, in Europe, and then deploy more troops in the Asia Pacific? Because it's clearly that the US will try to prioritize. So will nuclear weapons used in this prioritization to, yeah, that's my question.
We'll take one more and then back to John.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much for that amazing presentation. I just wanted to ask, you talked a little bit about human factor, the points of failure for nuclear weapons. So I want to ask about cybersecurity, cyber attacks. Do you think that with the sort of increased digitalization possibilities for cyber attacks, that this impacts nuclear security, and how, and if you're worried about that? Thank you.
John, back to you.
Sure, great questions. Declan, and talking about Ukraine. So look, nuclear weapons technology is 70 years old. Ukrainian nuclear scientists were part of the Soviet nuclear complex and know very well how to make and operate nuclear weapons. I think the question is, could they have taken a Soviet long-range ICBM, like the ones deployed at, say, Dnipropetrovsk or somewhere else, and launched them? The answer is clearly no. They didn't have the codes. They were under the control of Russian strategic rocket forces. But could they have taken those systems apart, taken the uranium and plutonium out of those weapons, fabricated them into weapons of their own, and eventually used them as a deterrent? Absolutely. Now, could they have survived as a country had they chosen to keep those weapons? You know, I'm sure there are a couple of great books written in both Russian and Ukrainian, as well as German, French, and a couple in English about that alternative future and whether or not there would have been a war or not. I, at the time, argued that if Ukraine refused to return those weapons to Russia, that not only would Russia likely move in militarily to seize them, but the United States and United Kingdom probably would be smart to assist Russia in doing so. Because having a brand new nuclear country born in 1991 with that sort of capabilities, I think would have shattered the norm of non-proliferation. You would have likely seen massive proliferation in Europe and elsewhere. And so there are a number of reasons why Ukraine decided rightly at the time to give up those weapons. But I have no doubt that Ukraine could have eventually become a fully fledged nuclear state. Also, the fact that most of the missiles were built and maintained in Ukraine itself, and that those facilities have had to be moved back to Russia. So, you know, the Ukrainian scientists and capabilities, I think, were pretty advanced and remain so. Kristen, on the question of, you know, do the United States have to choose? You know, it's not a black and white situation. We have nuclear capabilities that can reach China, that can reach North Korea, that can reach Russia. Our submarines, bombers, and long-range ground-based missiles are global, as are our ability to move troops by sea and air. And so I don't think you're going to see the United States say, all right, we're going to deter Russia with nukes, and we're going to take the conventional capabilities out of Europe and move them to East Asia. You're going to see the United States try to figure out how to do both, because the situations are very different. We're not worried about China launching a ground invasion of Taiwan. We're worried about them using naval forces and air forces to cut Taiwan off and then eventually take over. And so we don't need tanks to prevent that. We need ships, we need anti-ship missiles, and we need the ability to hold enough of what China cares about at risk to deter them from doing so. And it's important to keep in mind that continuum of deterrence, and neither Jessica and I talked about this because we're nuclear geeks, right, are economic and diplomatic and political as well as military. What Vladimir Putin cares about most has very little to do with nuclear weapons. But if he can't get his money out of Swiss banks, if his oligarch friends can't send their kids to school in Europe, or can't access their yachts in the Riviera, or can't keep pumping oil on the open market, that matters as much to him, I would argue, as whether the United States can put a nuclear weapon on the Kamchatka Peninsula. And so that continuum of economic as well as sanctions-based deterrence, I think, has been as effective, if not more effective, at influencing what his thinking is in Ukraine, than the prospect of nuclear weapons. What we don't know is where China is on that spectrum and what China cares about. We don't really have as much experience working with China to understand what they hold dear. It also is a weird world where in the Cold War, it wasn't that, I mean, it was a huge deal, obviously, but it wasn't hard for us to imagine that we could destroy what we needed to in Soviet Union to deter them without it affecting us, except because Russia would launch at us. But if we were to use nuclear weapons on China and destroy their defense industrial base, the world's defense industrial base, the world's economic base is destroyed. So we can't really hold at risk the things in China that we used to hold at risk in the Soviet Union in the same way. And that's a more complicated scenario that I really haven't seen people talk about, but to me, it is important. But the reality is we're going to use a mixture of both conventional and nuclear, as well as economic and political in both places. David, so, you know, there are a lot of people smarter than I am who have talked a lot about the risk of cyber to nuclear over the past several years. Herb Lynn has a recent book out from Stanford talking about the cyber threat. Amy Zygardt, who runs the Stanford Center, CSAC out there, has done some work. James Acton at the Carnegie Endowment in the United States has also talked a lot about this. And the Nuclear Threat Initiative has done a lot of work on this as well. The reality is that currently US nuclear weapons aren't digital. Some of the launch command and control is becoming increasingly integrated, but I'm not worried about a hacker accessing our nuclear weapons and launching them. I worry daily about a crisis where a hacker takes down our communications grid, or where they take down our early warning network, or through a denial of service attack, they're able to prevent Stratcom communications. We don't have what is portrayed in the movies in terms of, you know, these state-of-the-art communications capabilities. You'll be disappointed to know that the nuclear football is not a really shiny briefcase with maps and the thing going, you know, it really is just a black notebook with a bunch of flashcards in it. And you still have to pick up the phone and call somebody to make it work. And those phones are vulnerable. So I do worry about it, but not in quite the way that I think the question was intended about the vulnerability of launching nuclear weapons through you know, a keystroke.
Thank you, John. Next round.
There's a follow-up question by David.
Yeah, there's a follow-up question. I had a clarification about your comments on European deterrence. So could you just clarify what you said about European deterrence being mostly symbolic, that you have serious doubts about the ability of the nuclear weapons in Europe penetrating Russian airspace? And conversely, does Europe have any kind of protection against Russian attacks? Thank you.
Yeah, so I want to be clear with my language. US forward deployed nuclear capabilities in Europe, which are the focus of nuclear sharing and nuclear basing, in my view, and in the view of the military over many years, have not really been critical military components. They don't rely on them when it comes to the war plan because of serious doubts that they would be able to penetrate Russian air defense capabilities. And when you hear the Air Force talk about why it needs to have a next generation nuclear bomber and why it needs long range standoff cruise stealth missiles, they will tell you that Russia's A2AD anti-aircraft and air denial capabilities are so advanced that we can't rely on older systems to penetrate. So we can't have it both ways, where we say that F-35s or F-16s would be able to get to Kaliningrad, but the B-52 with air-launched cruise missiles can't. So I think there's a serious question about whether those capabilities would really be the ones we would rely on in a horrible situation where we actually needed or wanted to use nuclear weapons in against Russia. What we would do is rely on strategic capabilities, probably sea-launched cruise missiles or air-launched cruise missiles. Sorry, not sea-launched cruise missiles, air-launched cruise missiles, or long-range strategic missiles based on submarines. The problem with doing so, however, is when you launch a long-range missile or a long-range cruise missile at Russian territory, they don't know whether it's headed toward Kaliningrad or Moscow. And they don't know whether they're seeing all of them or not, which is, of course, the fallacy that the United States could escalate to the use of nuclear weapons and not have it then further escalate to global nuclear warfare. or that the Russians could launch a single nuclear weapon that we wouldn't respond to. So, but the particular point on nuclear weapons based in Europe being military weapons, in my view, I think has been pretty fairly answered. We spend a lot of money on these capabilities because they are political tools to knit the alliance together and show that we all have skin in the game, but are not frontline military capabilities that commanders rely on.
Great. Others?
Yes, there's one question in the chat from Valeria, who basically asked the question whether it's about the return of nuclear weapons to Russia, or they gave them to Russia because these were Soviet weapons, not Russian weapons. And for that reason, she points out that Ukraine participated in making them, and wants to know what John's opinion is about this.
Yeah, it's a great question. And of course, the answer depends on who you ask. The United States and Russia and the United Kingdom, as the depository states for the Non-Proliferation Treaty, said that Russia is the sole inheritor of the Soviet nuclear legacy, that they are the ones that have ownership over Russian nuclear weapons and will assume the Soviet Union's legal position in international treaties. But we had to negotiate a number of agreements in order to make that so, including not just the Budapest Memorandum, but something known as the Lisbon Protocols, which made Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan party to the original START Treaty, and said that they would become non-nuclear weapon states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, meaning the Soviet weapons were Russian weapons. However, the Ukrainians said, well, the weapons can be yours, but the uranium belongs to us. The uranium has value. We could sell it on the open market. You can't just take this or expect us to give it up and not be compensated for it. And so the United States and Russia agreed that they would return the weapons to Russia, but that Ukraine would be paid for the uranium value. So the Ukrainians could argue that, well, see, they really did belong to us. We got paid for them. And the Russians could argue we got what really mattered. And that's really where diplomacy came into play. We never said Ukraine doesn't own these weapons or these weapons don't belong to Ukraine. We simply said that Russia is the legal inheritor to the Soviet Union and will agree to disagree on whether or not they ever belonged to Ukraine, as long as Ukraine got what they wanted and we got what we wanted to.
Yeah, and John, on top of that, the Security Council issued this presidential statement on the 31st of January, 1992, which was agreed to by the 5 permanent members and the rest of the council, saying that Russia is the successor to the Soviet Union for all international commitments, including Russia is then the party responsible for the USSR's commitments to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine then joined later on as non-nuclear weapon states, as you mentioned, over time. More questions?
Well, actually, Tariq, let me respond, because I see that Jessica's added back into the chat. And of course, I assume that she was listening, and I'm glad she is. I mean, things do change, right? The F-35 is a more advanced system. And so if NATO military commanders and American military commanders believe that it has the ability to penetrate Russian airspace, that does change some of the calculus and may lead NATO to rely on those capabilities more. But it doesn't change the calculus that the United States or NATO dropping a nuclear weapon on Russian territory would be a significant escalation of any conflict. And what we have here is a mismatch. Russia believes that it could drop a nuclear weapon in, say, Germany, and that the United States would be deterred from responding by dropping a nuclear weapon on Russian territory. We say, no. We're not only not deterred from doing that, we have capabilities to do it. And we think that that's stabilizing. Russia looks at that capability and says, what do you mean you're going to attack Russian territory? That's a dramatic escalation. And the fact is that both are dramatic escalations that neither side could control. And instead of relying increasingly on how do we nuke each other, we'd be much better off pulling back, which is what the Biden administration has been trying to do, and saying, let's renew this discussion about arms control. Let's figure out whether there's a solution to the INF conundrum that Russia created. Let's see if there's a way that we could actually capture battlefield and tactical nuclear weapons in future arms control so that we could de-escalate our reliance on these capabilities. And in fact, Russia has refused to do that because they view our conventional capabilities as more threatening because they are more usable and more advanced than Russia's. And so then you quickly get into a question, okay, how do we capture both conventional and nuclear together? And that's something that NATO allies are not united on, because we rely on our conventional capabilities to deter, and the Russians view them as a threat. And so again, it's a mismatch that we have to wrestle with.
Okay, any further questions? And I don't think so, Tarek. So,
okay, then I'll ask another couple to John for him to carry on his excellent discussion with us here today. John, in the previous session, somebody asked Jessica about AUKUS, and one element of AUKUS is the United States providing nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. So these would be submarines that are powered by nuclear reactors, but will be conventionally armed. So the question here is, does this not, in a sense, dramatically increase the confrontation with China? And if Australia gets nuclear submarines, what's stopping South Korea, Japan, and other US allies, not to mention Iran has talked about nuclear submarines. We have Brazil, as you know, for a long time, looking for nuclear submarines, and Argentina. So would this not open a flood of non-nuclear weapon states operating nuclear-powered submarines and making the world, in my view, a more dangerous place?
Yeah, so there are two questions sort of packed into that, Tariq. One is sort of the China dynamic, and the second is the sort of norm about fueling submarines with weapons grade or highly enriched uranium. I mean, on the first one, I have a lot of concerns about where the U.S.-China confrontation is headed. There's no question that China has become more aggressive and is trying to dictate terms in East Asia and elsewhere to other countries, and that threatens U.S. allies and threatens principles that the United States and European countries care deeply about for the right reasons. However, I think there's been a lot of loose talk in the United States about China's nuclear capabilities, the most egregious being the chairman of the Joint Chiefs saying that Russia and China are carrying out Sputnik moments with the development of hyperglide or FOBs, these orbiting bombardment systems, when in fact this technology is something the United States could have done 30, 40 years ago and passed on because it doesn't really provide a strategic angle for us. But there is a fever in the United States, particularly in Washington, about this growing new nuclear Cold War dynamic with China, which I think arguably the United States has a good reason for wanting to head off. That President Biden, I think, has been trying to engage China in order to head off, repeating many of the mistakes of the Cold War, the nuclear components of that with China. But I'm not sure it's going to be successful. I think there is a real drumbeat in Washington for repeating sort of the nuclear deterrent Cold War dynamic with China. This despite the fact that even if China doubles its nuclear arsenal in the next 5 years, we will have 3,000 and they will have 500. So there's plenty of time for the United States to be able to respond effectively should China get to a point where it could threaten to destroy US nuclear capabilities and our deterrent. The submarine component, I think, is a relatively minor one. It's a focal point for China because it was such a visible gesture by the United States, but I don't think really changes the strategic dynamic in East Asia. The United States already operates a very capable submarine force. Other countries already have capable diesel and battery-powered submarines. So this will increase the life cycle. It will increase the ability to operate quietly, but I don't think changes the strategic dynamic. What it does is further consolidate the growing military alliance structure designed to take on China and its capabilities. And that's a dynamic that I don't have an answer to, but one that I obviously am concerned about. The question about whether the United States supplying nuclear-powered submarine to Australia opens a floodgate, Tariq is sort of teeing up a devil's advocate question because he has written and believes very strongly that countries can effectively use nuclear submarine programs as a front for developing the same capabilities they would need to build nuclear weapons. And that is possible. And we did see it in Brazil, where they said, oh, we're not interested in nuclear weapons. We just want nuclear propulsion. But in fact, they had a secret nuclear weapons program, and they were doing this for the purpose of building at least a latent capability. You know, I think if we get into a situation where Japan or South Korea or Iran want to build nuclear weapons, we'll be able to determine that, and we won't be fooled by their pursuit of a nuclear submarine capability. That might be useful in sort of negotiating rhetorical forum like the Conference on Disarmament. But if Japan and South Korea are going to go nuclear, we have much bigger problems in whether they're building submarines or using that. We'll have a breakdown in the global non-proliferation system and in the U.S. alliances around the world that actually help preserve stability. So I take the point, but I'm not actively worried about it. I think there are other bigger implications for that.
Yeah. Actually, John, my point was beyond the context of this particular webinar, which is about non-application of safeguards on naval nuclear propulsion reactors and nuclear fuel in non-nuclear weapon states. But that's for another discussion. And separately, I'll send you my latest paper on this, which was published in Australia last month. So there was a question in the chat by Claire. So do you want to put it to John directly?
Yeah, I'll do that. Claire, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. I actually had meant to hit enter. I just wrote it in so I wouldn't forget to ask the question when there was a moment to insert my, yeah. You mentioned James Acton at Carnegie, and I'd listened to him at the Carnegie's nuclear conference this past year. And he had made the argument that Russia's been really pushing for this asymmetrical exchange that, you know, if you do A, we'll do B, and eventually we'll both be kind of sort of happy for pursuing each other's, you know, mutual problems. Do you think that there's room for that? Because I know a lot of people are pushing for it, saying that that's really how we can de-escalate. Do you think that there's actually room for that?
Yeah, there's no doubt that if you put James and myself and Rose Gottemuller in a room with you know, the right Russians, we could negotiate a fantastic deal that any sane person would look at and go, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The United States does this with conventional weapons. The Russians do this with nuclear weapons. The US doesn't do certain missile defense capabilities. And the Russians don't do this on sort of cyber and space capabilities. We could negotiate that. And I actually think that the military would go, that makes good sense. We can do that. We would save a lot of money and we would be at much less risk. There is not a snowball's chance in Fiji that we would ever get that approved by the United States Senate. And so the inability of the United States to negotiate and codify and sustain negotiated agreements is a real detriment to the ability to shape the military and political landscape. And I don't have an answer for that. And I've not operated in a world before where that is the major or one of the major challenges. It may also be that Russia understands that and therefore is free to say, oh yeah, let's negotiate this asymmetric thing because they understand our politics quite well. They're as stunned by it, quite frankly, as we are, but they're much more willing to take advantage of it because they're looking to destabilize and throw both the alliance and the United States off balance. And we've seen that both through domestic political action as well as through diplomatic behavior. So we can do it, and I think it makes a lot of sense. I just don't think that we can make it stick. And so we're much more likely going to be stuck in a more traditional framework where we cap the number of weapons and we have these sort of reciprocal matching capabilities. Now, it may be Russia agrees to give up things they don't have and we give them up, and then Russia agrees to give up things we don't have and they give them up. That's possible, but then you would see members in the Senate say, well, why are we restricting these things? We're not getting anything, right? So, for example, if the United States were to say, we are willing to let Russian inspectors come and ensure that there are no cruise missiles at Aegis Ashore missile defense sites in Poland and Romania, and try to put that into some sort of legal basis, the US Senate would say, well, what are we getting out of that? And we would say, well, we get to go and see that Russia is not putting offensive launchers in Moscow. And they're like, we know they're not putting offensive launchers in Moscow. You're unilaterally restricting America and NATO, and you're not getting anything in return. And the ability to have these strategic, political, intellectual discussions with many members of the Senate, quite frankly, is just not possible because of the people that have been elected by the United States population into the Senate.
Okay, John. So finally, since you were at President Biden's side when the U.S. administration negotiated the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and now the Biden administration is here working in Vienna trying to bring it back, could you say your views on that? And finally, could you inform us what is Global Zero? What is its mission? And what can young people do to support Global Zero and other such missions to make the world a safer place?
Sure. Thanks, Tariq. That I'll send my check in for the plug. I appreciate it. Look, President Biden has wanted to get back into the JCPOA since Donald Trump violated the agreement back in 2018. I think it pales only in comparison to the invasion of Iraq in 2003 in terms of stupidity. That we had an agreement that was effectively verified that restricted Iran's ability to produce nuclear materials and to quickly break out of a non-proliferation regime and build weapons. So I think it's clear that the United States and its partners would like to get back into the agreement. I don't know whether Iran views it the same way, whether they think there are political and economic advantages worth the price at home for signing up to that agreement again. What I do know, and I just wrote a piece for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which says that you will not be able to get the 1-year breakout buffer that the JCPOA put in place because Iran is now much smarter and much more capable when it comes to operating nuclear machinery and equipment. And they are now likely several weeks away from being able to have enough material for a bomb. I'd like to get that to the months if I can. If I can put Iran in a situation where they can only have 300 kilograms of uranium enriched at any level, which is not enough for even a single nuclear weapon, and I can get that for another 9 years under the JCPOA, that's much better than the situation we're in today. I believe that President Biden views it that way too, but it's a question of whether we can all get back into that. So I don't know that we're going to do that. Global Zero is a really interesting and I think important organization because we're one of really the few global campaigners that say we need to work to get rid of nuclear weapons, and here's how we could do it. While I admire what the ban has done, the ban treaty has done in terms of taking a legal approach to try to put pressure on countries to move away from deterrence and to give up their nuclear arsenal, when you ask them what's the mechanics by which these countries will give up nuclear weapons, what's the verification provision, how quickly do these things have to happen, and what sort of transparency over nuclear material can you have, they say, look, that's not our problem, right? That's something for the states to work out. We actually have a blueprint that we've put together and have been pushing for the last decade for specifically how this would work and how many weapons each country would have, for how long, who would be responsible for taking them apart, what would happen to the materials. And so I encourage you to sort of look at our webpage, look at our Global Zero Action Plan, and sort of get involved in some of the details and the nuts and bolts. I know it can be a little dry at times. Even I think it's dry at times, but at least it's not as bad as nuclear export control. So, we can always make fun of them. And in terms of what people can do, the Global Zero was designed as a global movement. We have validators in each country. We have networks that people can participate in. We have groups that work on no first use as a goal in European countries and East Asian countries. But we believe that this is something where the people's opinion actually matters. And I would, again, not criticizing Jessica personally, but I think polling is very prone to manipulation depending on how you ask the question and what the context are. And so I don't doubt that if you say to people, we have nuclear weapons, do you think that we should continue to have them to protect ourselves? They'll say yes. If you say it's very likely that if we and Russia get into a war, nuclear weapons could be used, is that a good situation? Most people will say no. And so I think there is actually still a palpable demand for more sane nuclear policies in many of the countries involved in NATO. And I think that's part of what Global Zero wants, is an engaged population that actually is working on these issues. And it's why, frankly, I was glad to come and talk to the Atomic Reporters, because you obviously play a critical role in helping provide access to the population in plain language. What do these things mean? What's the history? What's actually going on? So thanks for taking the time to participate, and please reach out if I can be helpful as you do your work.
Thank you very much, John. And it's also the same for the Konrad Adenauer Multilateral Dialogue, which is promoting dialogue on these issues. So thanks very much, John, for sharing your thoughts with us here today. Over back to you, Peter and Claudia, to decide how much of a break you want before we come back with the next two speakers. Okay, so now we're starting our second half, and we will have this presentation by Sylvia will be on trends and challenges in a third nuclear age. Sylvia Mishra is Jan E. Nolan Nuclear Security Fellow at the Truman Center for National Policy and a doctoral researcher at King's College London. Her focus at the Truman Center lies on applying a lens of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice on nuclear policy. Mishra also is affiliated with the European Leadership Network as a new technology nuclear officer, where her research focuses on nuclear strategy and non-proliferation, South Asian security, and emerging and disruptive technologies. So over to you, Sylvia.
Thank you so much, Tariq, for the very kind introduction. And as always, it's great to be on a panel which is moderated by you, as I always get to learn a lot from your deep insights and scholarship. I am also very thankful to Peter for inviting me and Atomic Reporters for inviting me. It has been great collaborating with you, Peter, over the last couple of years through our connections with the CTBTO youth group. So I appreciate that very much. It is definitely a tough act to follow both John and Jessica, but I will try my best. Today, I'm going to present my remarks on the third nuclear age. I'll briefly talk about what I mean when I say the third nuclear age. What are some of the characteristics and drivers of the third nuclear age? Why should we be thinking about the risks and challenges that the third nuclear age poses, and also examine if there are some opportunities for greater nuclear risk reductions within the context of the changing geostrategic environment that we are today. And then I'll complete by finish off my remarks by a few recommendations that we possibly can do in order to strengthen strategic stability and also a focus on nuclear risk reduction measures. So it's almost 7 decades after the first atomic device was exploded in the New Mexico desert, and almost 3 decades after the end of Cold War. With this turn of the 21st century, there appears to be a recognition in both academic circuits and also policymaking circles that a new nuclear era is probably upon us. And so with the turn of the 21st century, this rapid pace of development of science and technology, it has produced a new strategic landscape. What we are witnessing today is a multipolar competition. It is coupled by a renewed arms race of expanding nuclear inventories and emerging and disruptive technologies that are challenging the existing nuclear deterrence paradigm that we know of. So during the course of my remarks, I'm going to be using this acronym EDTs. And when I say EDTs, I mean emerging and disruptive technologies. Now, just a little bit of a caveat when I say emerging and disruptive technologies, some of the technologies have already emerged. For example, there were some really smart questions on cyber, but cyber is not an emerging technologies, and there is scholarly debate on what is emerged and what is disruptive. But the reason why we are clubbing these technologies under the bracket of EDTs is because we really don't know to the greatest extent what are the impact of these technologies on nuclear doctrines, on nuclear weapons decision making, and also broadly on strategic stability issues. So the next time you hear me talk about EDTs, I mean emerging and disruptive technologies. Scholars have pointed out that the development of some of these EDTs are blurring the lines between what we know as nuclear weapons and non-nuclear forces. And this is what is really contributing to the marked and changed strategic landscape. One of the central characteristics of the third nuclear age is this idea of integration or commingling of nuclear and non-nuclear forces. And as John richly pointed out in his remarks earlier, James Acton has put and introduced this concept of entanglement, that like increasingly the fire breaks between what we understand traditionally as conventional and nuclear is gradually eroding. Now, entanglement of nuclear and non-nuclear will have an impact on doctrinal and operational readiness of nuclear weapons. And it is going to have a significant impact on deterrence relationship. Now, we are today in a multipolar and multiplex deterrent relationship which is distinctly different from that of the Cold War that we had known of the United States and Soviet Union. Now we have almost 9 nuclear armed countries with different nuclear deterrent relationship, which are always evolving. And then there are also changing ties and bilateral and multilateral relations among some of these nuclear armed countries. So in the third nuclear age, we are seeing that there is a increasingly overt push to develop some of these game-changing, some of these dual-capable weapons, and also apply innovatively some of these technologies on the battlefield. For instance, in 2002, for the first time, we know that the United States used the Predator drones for targeted killing, and which really introduced a very different kind and really introduced us to the future of warfare, where there was a bloodless targeted killing. So it seems that with the turn of the 21st century, application of some of these new technologies are slated to change the way that wars have been fought before. And some of the drivers of the third nuclear age include, as I briefly mentioned, the emergence of the non-nuclear weapons, or these EDTs, and incorporation of these EDTs in military doctrines of different countries. Again, so with the emergence of these several EDTs, the global nuclear governance is coming under significant pressure. And to an extent, a lot of scholars have also pointed out that the lack of regulation of these EDTs has brought so much pressure on the global governance, to the effect that global governance of these issues are almost, could be argued, is almost being eroded. There is a reduction in the interest of just looking at nuclear weapons which pose an existential threat, but the combination of EDTs with nuclear weapons is once again really posing a serious and a dangerous, and also, if we can argue, an aggressive posturing, which we are probably not most well equipped to address. Now, in the future, there are a number of technologies that we are seeing, the EDTs, which are emerging and are disruptive. For example, quantum technology applications, cyber weapons, artificial intelligence, deep fakes, autonomous weapons, and adaptive network of armed drone swarms, to just name a few. So not only these emerging technologies have applications, but they are also interacting amongst themselves. And this is really posing a huge challenge in terms of how decision makers are, and decision makers' ability to manage, assimilate, interpret, and trust and verify the information that are impacting nuclear weapons decision makers' corpus of decision making. So it's important to also think, what are some of the risks and challenges that the integration of these EDTs are posing with the development of nuclear weapons. The first is a fog of crisis. Now, technology-driven complexity is thickening the fog of war in unprecedented ways. Now, the impact of this can be debated, but then there is a broad consensus amongst scholars who are looking at EDTs and their impact on nuclear weapons decision-making, that decision makers eventually would be overwhelmed with the idea of processing a vast amount of information under very strict timelines. The fact that EDTs are also shortening decision-making windows and timelines for nuclear weapons decision makers is another challenge. And therefore, it is important in this 21st century to look at the complexity of not just the technologies, but the complexity of how it's thickening the fog of war. And therefore, once again, reiteration of and clarity of nuclear doctrines from the nuclear armed countries is of essence in this 21st century. Second is the multiplayer environment. The environment and nuclear decision making that we know of at the height of Cold War is distinctly different from that of today. And now we have a multiplayer environment where not only governments, some of the nuclear armed countries' governments possesses these emerging technologies, but a lot of non-nuclear weapons countries are actively developing and expanding their inventories when it comes to non-nuclear weapons or emerging and disruptive technology. And also it is important to note that large corporations and the private sector companies are also simultaneously investing and developing some of these technologies. And the inclusion of multiple players also makes the decision-making field and realm crowded, which can have an impact, especially during a crisis. Third is the challenge of a non-linear escalation. Now, some really fantastic work is being developed and done by Rebecca Hirschman and her team at CSIS Pony, which talks about the fact that there might be a wormhole escalation. What do I mean by that? It seems that traditionally all nuclear tinged crises has followed an escalation of a ladder, an escalation graduated pathway to a crisis. And of course, like countries have taken de-escalation and off-ramps measures to diffuse the crisis. But it seems with the emergence of emerging and disruptive technologies, it seems that there is no one sure way of traversing through the escalation ladder, but it might be so that countries engaged in a crisis might just skip a few ladders in the process. Fourthly, I know Rose Gottemuller always comes up when we are discussing EDTs, and she has done a fantastic report on what she calls as the standstill conundrum, which really looks at how EDTs are impacting the three essential C's that Jessica in the morning spoke so eloquently about the three C's of deterrence: capabilities, communication, and credibility, as in how EDTs are impacting and making the second strike capabilities of countries much more vulnerable. They also spell an uncertain future of what communications or capabilities and credibility might look like for nuclear armed countries. And therefore, as I mentioned, it is once again so important for countries at this moment to clarify what their declaratory policies are, clarify what their nuclear red lines are, and also clarify their nuclear posture. Fifth, this is the second last risk that I'm going to dwell on, is domestic communication, public pressures, and audience costs. Peter Rickwood and I have done some work specifically looking at the South Asian crisis scenario. What happens when there's an impact of social media and the fact that a lot of posturing happens on social media. Now, national leaders are taking to social media to signal policies to an extent. So what are some of those kind of pressures on nuclear decision making with the introduction of social media that is on fray? And then lastly, just the introduction of EDTs really raises the chances of miscalculation, inadvertent escalation, and unintended consequences. I'll give you an example. I follow nuclear competition and rivalry amongst China, India, and Pakistan very closely. Now, all these three countries are really trying to perfect their second strike capabilities and launch nuclear weapons at sea. The Western Indian Ocean water is contested and congested. The fact that countries like Pakistan are putting conventional nuclear weapons, conventional missiles on nuclear tipped missiles on conventional submarines is injecting a lot of ambiguity, and especially at a time when there's this presence of both Indian and Chinese SSBNs in the waters of the Indian Ocean, which has several choke points. And of course, during a crisis that could really lead into a lot of quick conflict escalation at in the very congested waters of the Western Indian Ocean. But then we've really spoken about some of the consequences and risk and challenges of EDTs, but it is important for us as analysts and scholars to also raise the question that are there some areas of opportunities with the development of these technologies? Can these be put into good use for better data collection? For example, can technologies really strengthen deterrence? How can technologists make deterrence more robust? Can we improve our data quality and make communication channels more resilient with including EDTs to prevent a negative scenario? To this extent, Jessica Cox has an excellent paper which really talks about how to incorporate artificial intelligence in order to bolster and strengthen data collection through geospatial analysis, and how a better quality and quantity of information can really help decision makers to have more timely and relevant information and have a better situational awareness of conflict scenarios. I would go to some of the policy recommendations, and the first one is, it is because we are at a churning, it is very important for nuclear armed countries to engage in constructive dialogue. And it is not only the onus should not only just be within the NPT framework, because the NPT does not really cover several of the other nuclear armed countries, namely India and Pakistan. So it's extremely important that all the 9 nuclear armed countries are engaged in dialogue, and so that they can have better clarity and have a better understanding of what are each other's red line, what constitutes strategic stability, and therefore better manage nuclear crisis. The second one is, it's really important to understand how these new technologies can play a role into the escalation framework. And through these technologies, can we also devise some off-ramp measures? Can we come to some confidence building measures amongst these countries? And how can we then design and measure what are some of the acceptable escalation limits that some of these countries which are locked into an adversarial or conflictual diets, what are some of the acceptable risk and escalation limits that they can impose on themselves? So better clarification of those is extremely important. And then I know that there is much less discussion and debate and scholarship happening on what could be, or exploring the development of regulatory frameworks concerning emerging technologies. But it is the popular argument is that some of these technologies have not even really developed or matured. So therefore, preventing the development of a technology and discussing the regulations might be a more preventive action. But it is extremely important to also understand how these emerging technologies can be incorporated within the existing body of international law, rather than inventing newer laws to regulate some of these technologies. Involving the industry in the conversation. Where I work at the European Leadership Network, we've really been able to benefit from our amazing network of 300 former decision makers on both strategic and conventional issues. And one of the consistent recommendations that we've always heard is the importance of involving industry players, because as I mentioned, the environment that we are today in involves a number of stakeholders, and one missing piece of the puzzle is not involving industry players in the discussions, because there is an onus that there are so many commercial aspects of R&D in these technologies, but they also present a lot of challenges when it comes to proliferation, and therefore new partnerships to engage the industry is extremely important to understand what are the risks associated with some of these technologies. And second, and lastly, which is a point which is very close to my heart, something that I have been working on for the last couple of years, is the importance, and I always try to make good use of a platform that's given to me to underscore the importance of including diverse voices and the need to look at nuclear weapons in a more intersectional manner. For a very long time, we have been looking at nuclear weapons issues in a more straitjacketed manner, but it is important to see how the existence, the production, the expansion of nuclear weapons also impact different communities of color, has impacted the frontline communities who has been the most adversely affected by nuclear weapons, or for that matter, we need to make those linkages clear about how nuclear weapons have a direct impact and bearing on climate change issues. And therefore, it is important to include diverse voices. The diversity of perspectives when it comes to nuclear weapons decision making is extremely critical, because today we are in a very changed environment. I would like to conclude by stating a quote. It's from the United States Deputy Secretary of Defense, former, I would say, William Lynn. And he said, few weapons in history of warfare once created have gone unused. And for me, as I work and analyze emerging technologies, this really stood out to me because in a similar vein, President Harry Truman, in the address to the American people after the Hiroshima bomb, the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, he stated, "Having found the bomb, we have used it." So this idea of inevitability of the use of weapons have proven or is projected to be effective, but it's not new, right? If we historically look, it has been that case that the production and employment of weapons, for example, the crossbow or various firearms, has proceeded despite several attempts to regulate and regulate these technologies. And therefore, to conclude, I would say that even though several of these EDTs are in a development stage and we do not know their full effect, their application and their implications, however, it is very likely that some of these states might be tempted to use or prematurely deploy these emerging and disruptive technologies to gain a first mover advantage in a crisis, and therefore which might actually have a disastrous consequences, because we still don't know what is the extent of harm that these specific technologies can do. And therefore it is so important for our generation to be actively engaged when it comes to nuclear weapons policy and nuclear weapons decision making, and raise our voices through advocacy, through scholarship, through engagement, to really hold our governments accountable as global citizens, accountable to what our future holds for us. With that, I'll stop and I'll look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Sylvia. That was a really impressive presentation that covered a lot of issues in a very complex topic. So once again, I ask Alexander to keep track of those who would like to ask questions or make comments and to give the floor to them.
Okay, so far we don't have any questions.
Okay, so while you're thinking, let me put a couple of questions to Sylvia. So Sylvia, unless you misspoke, you said earlier in your presentation, when you were talking about the Predator drone, that this was a bloodless targeted killing. If you look at the costs of war project of the Watson Institute at Brown University, they point to nearly 1 million casualties in the post 9/11 conflicts. And they point to more than 2,000 civilian deaths from drones in Pakistan and about the same number in Afghanistan and so on. So I was wondering what you meant by that formulation, bloodless targeted killing, if that's really what you meant to say.
No, Tariq, you're absolutely right. When I meant bloodless, I meant from the perspective of the state of the United States, because they're not putting a pilot in harm's way. From the US perspective, it's bloodless.
From
but
the
you're
attacker's
absolutely
perspective.
correct. Yes.
Okay. And one other point I think which was very important is the role of industry. And I think in some of these technologies, industry is more advanced than governments in surveillance and artificial intelligence and so on. So again, could you say a little bit more on how to bring industry in? Because this is quite a controversial issue. And as you know, many employees of Google went on strike, and they didn't want Google to provide the technology to the US Department of Defense. And they said, we want to use our technologies for peaceful purposes.
I think that's a great question, Tariq. I appreciate it. I believe one of the advantages that we have as scholars and academics is our ideas and our ability to inject some bold ideas that often government officials and are not probably able to advance, and therefore for me, I have been thinking about this question very deeply, and the role of industries also mean to me that there might be some aspects of arms control, of nuclear risk reduction. And I say this because we are seeing how especially NATO in the last couple of years have included cyber and space domains as the two latest war fighting domains, right? Especially with space, I see that there is a space to engage industry when it comes to arms control issues, because there is a huge aspect of commercialization of this outer space that's happening with asteroid mining, with several other industry players becoming an active stakeholder in the outer space. So, and therefore, but then simultaneously, we're also seeing developments of counter space and satellite killing platforms that several countries are advancing. So at the intersection of two, I believe with the inclusion of industry players, there might be a situation where countries and different stakeholders can come together and look at opportunities where there is like greater legal and regulatory frameworks so as to ascertain and buttress greater risk reduction measures. And therefore, I believe to once again provide an impetus to the waning arguments of arms control, and like the fact that we are asking, is arms control really dead? I think through the injection of these bold ideas that where industries can play a significant role, I believe that it is important for us to think about ways, because of commercial interest of different industries, it might be it might be so that the inclusion of industry might have a more stabilizing effect on some of these parallel developments.
Okay, thank you. I'll come back on this later if we have time, but people are now beginning to put questions in chat. So Alexander, maybe you Alexander, maybe you can pick up from there.
Yes, so Shiri has a question probably.
Why don't you put them on the screen? They can ask the question themselves.
Exactly, so I think Shiri should ask it herself. She's there. Shiri? Okay, her video is off at the moment. Right. She says. So she's basically asking if you believe another Cold War is inevitable, and also asks about the quote that you mentioned that military material, in this case the bomb, would be used as it is in existence. So bullying countries by threatening to use the bomb might be inevitable when a Cold War starts. Okay, yes, she apologizes for the technological problem.
And there are some other chat questions as well, or some raised hands?
Well, this is all from Shiri, and there are no raised hands as far as I can see at the moment.
Okay, so maybe Sylvia, you can go ahead, and we encourage others to take this opportunity to ask questions of Sylvia or make comments on her presentation.
I think it's a thoughtful question, Therese, and I appreciate you asking me. So I do believe that there is a clear military revolution that's happening. And whilst it might not be just inevitable that countries are more inclined to use the nuclear weapons, but it seems that with the integration of emerging and disruptive technologies with nuclear weapons, nuclear weapons might come in the fray, not overtly at the start, because most of the crises are not nuclearized at the start, but like there is an escalation ladder. So I don't see that the inevitability of countries to be pushed to use nuclear weapons, but it seems that with the greater integration and blurring the lines and fire breaks amongst what we know as conventional and nuclear, there is a huge chance of greater inadvertent escalation, miscalculation, and also I think John in his presentation did refer to, and he really eloquently argued that we have relied far too long and far too often on nuclear weapons to function, but at the end of the day, they're still weapons, they're still machines, and they are susceptible to failure. So the accidental use is something that I have also been concerned about. So I wouldn't certain about the inevitability of the use, but then I am very concerned about the surrounding nuclear dangers around this developments of EDDs and their integrations with nuclear weapons.
Thank you. More questions, comments, raised hands? I see at least one.
Yes, Declan has raised his hand, so please go ahead.
Hi, so yeah, thanks for the presentation, Sylvia. I just wanted to ask about the role that, we've spoken about cyber security and how these emerging technologies are affecting the third nuclear age. I just wonder if you had any thoughts on the use of online misinformation and whether that comes into the, how much that plays into this third nuclear age that we're in or could do in the future, and whether you think perhaps that the use of online misinformation could even potentially be classed as an EDT, or whether that might be a bit extreme.
I think that's a great question, and this is something that I do think requires much more scholarship and carefully thought out and calibrated studies to really understand the impact and extent of misinformation and disinformation. Like we have seen its implications in like national processes in the 2016 elections, more closely the Pulwama Balakot crisis. For context, there was a nuclear tinged crisis between India and Pakistan where the population of both the countries really took to social media, and so did national leaders, which really made the ecosystem very fractured. And therefore, it is important to really understand the extent of the dynamics that social media can play. In terms of specific to the role of cybersecurity, like there are great works done on like how cybersecurity can really impact and impede communication lines, and especially have an impact and bearing on nuclear command control and communications, and impact NC3 systems. That's important. Another area that has been of concern is the use of deep fakes, and like what are some of those implications in nuclear crises. We've seen in the latest crisis in Ukraine and the unfolding geopolitical climate, Russia's use of and Russia's resort to information warfare. Now, what I believe they do in the first place is really make the ecosystem very crowded and congested, so much so that a lot of the general populace is unable to read facts of and ground realities. Now that creates a whole lot of compulsions probably for decision makers, for national leaders, because they are also having to respond to a domestic audience. They are also having to respond to domestic pressures of citizens. So I believe that is how that they play a significant role in terms of really speeding up and making the fog of war much more thicker.
Excellent. It's not only social media, nowadays it's also mainstream media. And you see that in the current context between Russia and Ukraine. So there are, I think, some more questions in chat.
No, this was still to wrap up from Cherry, but we have another question from Christian.
Yeah,
please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation, and I understand the dangers. And you talked about this wormhole escalation and all this concept. Do you think that the no first use policy declared by all the nuclear weapon states will help in basically mitigate the dangers of new technologies? Or because as far as I understand, is a lot of misunderstanding can be in the beginning of the conflict, or a lot of escalation can rapidly escalate, and the time, as you said, is reduced. So a no first use policy adopted by all nuclear countries, I think, in your opinion, will mitigate this danger of new technologies?
Christian, I think that's a thoughtful question. I do think that a declaration of no first use policies by the nuclear armed states is definitely going to reduce nuclear risk and dangers. But I would say and argue that often no first use policies are or the adoption of no first use policies have to be backed by substantive actions when it comes to military posturing. For instance, if a country adopts a no first use policy, but really prepares its military and forces in a way where they are looking at operational readiness, where they are looking at hair trigger alert platforms and system, it really does not bolster their no first use pledge. I believe a no first use pledge substantiated by specific actions which takes off systems from hair trigger alert and operationally high levels of readiness alert is important. And saying that, the second point I would make is not often adversaries in a conflictual dyad really accepts the no first use policies. I believe that there's a huge gap and misperception and mistrust amongst states, where states do not really accept or a no first use pledge. For instance, China has a no first use policy, but US and not just Western interlocutors, but also scholars and India have looked at several I would say discrepancies or like non-committal no first use policies in China's pledge. Again, but then this is not just China. Even India has a no first declaratory policy since the time India first tested nuclear weapons. But again, that is subjected to a lot of mistrust from its primary adversary, Pakistan. So I believe that just adopting a no first use pledge is not enough. It is important to really first bridge the misperception, miscommunication, and mistrust gap amongst adversaries. And then the third is really one has to take substantive actions related to operational readiness of some of the nuclear forces.
Thanks. So time has flown very quickly. So if there's any last question before we ask Sylvia to wrap up.
So far, there are none.
Okay.
Any raised
so Sylvia,
hands?
You also set up Indian Women in International Relations, IWIR. And since you talk both of Pakistan and India, these days, in the social media and the political space in the two countries, there's a lot of vituperative dialogue. And so how about having a South Asian women's organization where you get women from both sides who are prepared to talk to bridge the gaps rather than exacerbate the gaps, as seems to be the case, unfortunately, now on both sides between social media, some media commentators and politicians. And also if you have any final comments regarding the issue that you spoke to us so eloquently about.
Tariq, first of all, thank you so much. I think that's an excellent idea. I'll be happy to brainstorm and take your inputs and suggestions on that. Saying that, I would say that it's really been the strategic community that has been driving a lot of the track 2 dialogue that has really helped in demystifying a lot of the misperceptions that adversaries locked into adversarial relationship and conflictual dyads have. So I want to take a step back and acknowledge the importance of NGOs, the excellent role that NGOs play, different organizations play to contribute to a greater understanding, a greater shared perception of what are the threats and better understanding each other's threat perceptions, red lines. This is just a call to action for different organizations and organizations in the and NGOs to continue bridging that gap, continue fostering that people to people relationship, which is so critical and more than ever right now. Secondly, I think it is very important for young women to get involved in heart security issues. I started off my career, and this is just an anecdote I would like to share because I am very impressed by the amazing group and cohort of young women who are on this call. I started my career where almost 5-6 years back, working on nuclear policy issues, where I was told that I shouldn't be working in this domain. It is a technical field. It is heart security and not really meant for women to pursue. And I was asked to stick to my lane of doing foreign policy and geopolitical analysis. Well, I put my foot down, but it is important to really encourage and amplify young voices. It's important to get more younger women to dedicate to heart security issues, because it's something that not just affects one section of the population, it affects us all, and therefore a greater and a more equitable table of nuclear weapons decision makers is of essence. And lastly, when it comes to emerging and disruptive technologies, I would say that it is a little bit technical, but it really, and that is why it is important for younger people to get more involved and understand some of these technologies, maybe invest in taking a cybersecurity crash course, but it is important to invest and study some of these technologies, because this is something that we are going to grapple with in the foreseeable future. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Sylvia. You had an excellent presentation and excellent comments. And I think we all need to understand that there is a narrative and views beyond the Euro-Atlantic discussion or discourse format, because we normally basically focus on what the Americans, Russians, and the Europeans are saying. And here we have a very good example of a voice from India, even though Sylvia is working in Washington. She's sort of bridging the gap between India, South Asia, and North America. And I think we in Atomic Reporters and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in our dialogue, we need to bring in more voices beyond the normal group that we engage in discourse. So thank you again, Sylvia, for your excellent presentation. And we look forward to having further interactions with you as time goes by, and wish you all the best in your doctoral studies. So now we move on to our fourth speaker of the evening, and she will be speaking on nuclear policy, a U.S. perspective. So Abigail Stowe-Thurston is program coordinator working on no-frills use policy. Previously, she worked at the Federation of American Scientists, where she provided research and logistical support to the FAS International Study Group on North Korea policy, and has published independent research on arms control and strategic stability between the United States, Russia, and US policy on North Korea and other nuclear weapons policy matters. So over to you, Abigail.
Hi, Tarek. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'd really like to thank Peter for inviting me here and for you all for joining us today. I know it's getting quite late in your time zone, so thank you so much for sticking around and for listening to this talk. As Tarek mentioned, my name is Abigail Stowe-Thurston, and I'm actually a project lead at an international nonprofit called CRDF Global. We work very closely with the Department of State to implement programming for the Office of Cooperative Threat Reduction. But previously in my career, I did spend some time working at different think tanks and advocacy organizations. And most recently, I served as a nuclear security fellow on Capitol Hill, serving a member of Congress. And so that brings me to my presentation today. I'm here to talk a bit about the US policymaking process with regards to nuclear weapons. So really, I became interested in nuclear policy when I was in high school or just after high school. I spent some time living in Russia on a State Department funded language program. And that was where I really experienced the power of person-to-person diplomacy, some of those interpersonal connections that Sylvia was talking about, and how that connects with and sometimes is in tension with diplomacy between governments and intergovernmental relationships. And so that really made me interested in nuclear weapons policy issues, and that's what brought me to this point. So I've been working at a variety of think tanks and things since about 2016. My objectives for this talk today are to really help you understand who is responsible for making nuclear policy in the United States context, what some of the substance and goals of US nuclear policy are, and why it matters. So starting with who, I'd like to focus on two parts of the US government that are really important for developing policy. And really what I want to do here is point you towards some resources so that when you're working on a story or reporting on a topic related to US nuclear policy, and you have a question about who matters or what they think, you'll be able to find the right resource and go straight to that source to figure it out. So starting with the executive branch, the United States has three branches of government. I would say the executive branch and the legislative branch are the most relevant for nuclear policymaking. For the executive branch, we're really thinking first and foremost about the White House and the National Security Council. And these are stakeholders who are directing policy and setting overarching objectives. So we're thinking about the president sitting in the Oval Office. Of course, he has many advisors. thinking about what his specific priorities and objectives for US nuclear policy are. That information trickles down into United States federal agencies. And there are 3 federal agencies that I think are especially important for understanding the US nuclear policymaking process. First is the Department of Defense, which is responsible for developing national security and national defense strategies, thinking at a big strategic level about what are requirements for US forces and for allied forces. So doing that force posture planning role, and then also making acquisitions. And specifically for nuclear weapons, we're thinking about the weapon systems and specifically the delivery systems. So the Department of Defense and the armed services in the United States are responsible for delivery systems like submarines, planes, silos, missiles, gravity bombs, but they actually don't have a lot of jurisdiction over the physical nuclear warheads, because that authority lives at the Department of Energy. So under the Department of Energy, there is a semi-autonomous agency called the National Nuclear Security Administration, or NNSA, and they're really primarily responsible for stockpile management. So they ensure the safety, security, and effectiveness of US nuclear warheads, and they're responsible for the maintenance and the creation of them. So if we are thinking about a directive from the president to build more of a certain type of nuclear weapon, you would have 2 agencies working on that. You would have the Department of Defense working on the delivery system, and then you would have the NNSA working along with national laboratories on developing the actual pits that go into the nuclear warhead. And so already you can start to see how all of this is kind of subdivided, and it can get very complex very quickly because you have many different agencies with different equities who are all contributing to this policymaking process. The third agency that I'd like to mention is the Department of State, which is responsible for the United States relationships with international countries and international organizations. So relevant to nuclear non-proliferation and other non-proliferation issues, certainly the United Nations, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. I mentioned that one because I think there are some connections between nuclear non-proliferation and preventing chemical proliferation and the use of chemical weapons. But the Department of State is really, set apart from the physical nuclear weapons themselves, set apart from some of those questions about posture and strategy. And they're really thinking more about arms control and diplomacy. So how do we use these other tools in our toolbox to manage nuclear risk? And how do those policy aspects come into play? So in the executive branch, these are kind of the main players that I'm thinking about when I'm trying to analyze nuclear policy decisions. They really kind of fit together like puzzle pieces. So you heard me say they each advocate for different equities. And, regardless of how good an idea they have might be, you might have someone at the State Department who has an excellent idea. You might even have a president, a head of state who has an excellent idea for reducing nuclear risk or posturing nuclear weapons differently. Virtually every policy costs money. And in the United States, the Congress or the legislature has the power of the purse strings. So you have a certain level of policy development and implementation that you can have within the executive branch. But when it comes to finances, you really have to incorporate the Congress. And it's really important to understand the committees that are involved with those decisions and the different documents that you might want to look at as reporters as you're reporting on some of these topics. So I'm not going to go into details on the legislative process. There are lots of resources that I can point you to for that. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have about how a bill becomes a law and how these pieces fit together. But really, I want to kind of highlight which parts of Congress would be especially relevant in your work. So on the policy side, when it comes to nuclear policy, we're thinking about the House and Senate Armed Services Committees. Specifically in the House and in the Senate, we have strategic forces subcommittees. And so these are committees that are thinking about specifically the defense side of nuclear weapons policy. When it comes to the actual funding, where the rubber hits the road, we're thinking about appropriations. That's the word in the United States Congress for the committees that actually divide up funding and allocate it to specific agencies for specific purposes. So they might kind of take note of what the policy committees are thinking about, but they really operate quite independently, which is interesting. And they're really making those key decisions about who's going to get funding and what priorities will get funding versus which ones will not get funding. Within the House and Senate appropriations committees, there are several subcommittees that are important. So we have the subcommittee on defense, the subcommittee on state and foreign operations, and the subcommittee on energy and water. And you will notice that those align very closely with the federal agencies that we just talked about. So basically, each of those subcommittees has some level of responsibility for either the Department of State or the Department of Defense or the Department of Energy and the NNSA. So policy and appropriations committees really hold a lot of hearings and do quite a bit of research to learn more about the administration's policy priorities and the broader strategic environment in order to make these really critical funding decisions. I have to say, you know, having worked in Congress for about a year, members of Congress and their staff are extremely busy, and they are responsible for a huge portfolio that covers a lot of different topics. And their very first priority is to serve the district that elected them. And so sometimes these very technical issues like nuclear weapons can be, you know, maybe not their primary focus. And so when you look at these specialized committees like the appropriation subcommittees that I mentioned, that's where you'll find some members who have developed some expertise. You also find members of staff who have a certain level of expertise working on these topics. But it's not necessarily common knowledge. And so hearings are a really great way for members of Congress and their staff to gather information. They conduct hearings with different stakeholders. So in some cases, it's public officials like the NNSA administrator, or civilian officials from the Department of State or the Department of Defense. Sometimes they meet with military leaders like the U.S. Strategic Command and similar, you know, other military commands to get their perspective. And sometimes they hold hearings with outside experts. So they'll be meeting with civil society groups, think tanks, academics like Sylvia, etc. Often these hearings are public and they're accessible online. So you can actually go to the websites for these committees and subcommittees, and you can watch the video recordings of the hearings that have already happened. They'll typically post the schedule for hearings that are coming up. So you can have those on your calendar and you can watch them online. Some hearings are classified, and so those are obviously not posted online, but I think the vast majority of them are available for you to watch if that's something that you're interested in, or if you have questions. Specifically, you can keep an eye out for what specific kind of leaders in the policy space are going to be, you know, at hearings giving testimony. That testimony is really valuable because it's a good metric for what the administration is thinking about. The words that people say in hearings are thought out very specifically. And so reading through or listening through what is being said in hearings, both by members of Congress, but also by the public officials who are testifying, that is an excellent source of information, and it can be really important. So again, for the sake of time, I will not go into the legislative process today. I'm not going to tell you how a bill becomes a law, but the bottom line here is that there are a lot of different voices. There's a lot of deliberation, and there's a lot of painstaking work that goes into the nuclear policymaking process, just like any other policymaking process. And of course, this is happening alongside domestic politics and domestic priorities, developments in the international security environment, like what we're seeing between Russia and Ukraine right now, and the imperative to respond to crises like COVID-19. So it's very difficult, and there are a range of interests at stake. And as you're thinking about stories to write on these topics, I would encourage you to think about what the stakeholders are and what they're interested in. I think that provides a lot of insight, and that can be kind of neglected sometimes in what we see on nuclear issues in the news. So moving on to the what of nuclear policy in the United States. there are really three main points that I think there's general agreement on. So most people, most analysts, most policymakers agree that these three things should work together in United States nuclear policy. Those are deterrence, so leveraging military capability to prevent war. I know that Jessica Cox talked about that with you earlier today. Arms control, so implementing measures to prevent arms racing and improve transparency and stability. And non-proliferation, so preventing the spread of nuclear weapons to countries that do not already have them. Again, there are some exceptions. There are some people who believe that only disarmament should be the objective of US nuclear policy, but by and large, I think there's pretty clear consensus on those three topics. And so the major debates come out in the policy-making community and the analytic community on how to meet those objectives and how to prioritize those objectives. So when we're thinking about deterrence, we're thinking about which types of nuclear weapons do we need? What size should they be? How and where do we need to posture them in order to effectively deter conflicts without inadvertently escalating crises? When it comes to arms control, there are a lot of questions about when it's appropriate to engage in arms control. How much can or should we reduce our nuclear stockpile? And when should we do that in tandem with another country versus when is it appropriate to make some of those decisions unilaterally? How can arms control and deterrence support one another? I know Jessica mentioned that clarity and credibility are important. So how can we use the transparency provided by arms control measures to kind of enhance and support our deterrence policy? And then when it comes to non-proliferation, I think we're really looking at how we use incentives and the threat of punishment together to prevent countries from acquiring nuclear weapons. And this is a problem that we've been dealing with for decades and decades, but how do we promote the safe use of nuclear energy, which can be very powerful, while preventing weaponization of those programs? So I'm sure none of these questions are new and they're quite familiar to you. I know you've attended several of these seminars, so you may already be very familiar with them, but thinking through those questions through the lens of the different stakeholders that we talked about earlier, I think this is really where you can start to see some narratives coming together. And so that it was really interesting to me. Lastly, I wanted to answer the question, why does all of this matter? Why does nuclear policy matter? And I really just want to reiterate what Sylvia said earlier. I think it is definitely an opaque process. We've talked about how complex it is. I've tried to distill it into a 20-minute talk today. And that's very difficult. There's a lot going on. There are, individual interactions that happen on a daily basis that lead to broader policy decisions. And so it's really important to understand both the technology behind nuclear capabilities and the policymaking process behind them, because that's how we can hold our governments accountable and really just raise our basic level of understanding about what the policy even is, because that can be surprisingly difficult to ascertain sometimes. So I will close there. Thank you so much again for being here, and thank you for having me. And thank you to Sylvia for taking my place while I was momentarily delayed earlier. I really appreciate that. And I'm happy to take any of your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Abigail. That was a very good presentation describing how the U.S. System works. You had mentioned the CRDF Foundation. So for those who do not know, it stands for the Civilian Research and Development Foundation, which was set up as part of the U.S. Cooperative Threat Reduction Initiative in 1995 to deal with unemployed scientists and others in the former Soviet Union and the new independent states coming out of the Soviet Union. And I think for people wanting to understand better U.S. defense spending and policy, there are a number of U.S. official outlets like the Congressional Research Service, whose reports are actually on your website, your previous website of the Federation of American Scientists. There's also the Government Accountability Office, GAO, and also the Congressional Budget Office, which produce official positions on what the U.S. government is spending money on with regard to defense and weapon systems. And I'm forgetting the name of a think tank that actually assesses the efficiency of U.S. defense spending. Perhaps, Abigail, you might tell us what that might be. So floor is open for questions and comments addressed to Abigail.
At the moment, aren't any, but I think, oh yeah, Christian has just come online, and I think there was a question from Felix, but I think he withdrew. So Christian, first of all.
Thank you for the presentation. It's interesting. I was more interested, given the fact that you work in Congress, that you explain how the policy in US, the legislative policy works. There's a lot of discussions, and some NGOs are complaining that the military industrial complex are lobbying, are having a lot of power in Congress, and NGOs that are against the proliferation of nuclear weapons, or they are complaining that they cannot fight with such big companies like Lockheed Martin, those companies which are basically have a lot of impact. I want to know your assessment, how much this lobby or of the industrial complex on the nuclear policies. We now see in US that the new spending to modernize the weapons, and I just want to know your assessment, because there's a lot of conflicting ideas. And
okay. Are there any other comments or questions? Abigail, to the question I might also add when we respond to this, it's generally believed that the major defense contractors spend a lot of lobbying money, lobbying the 537 congressmen and senators, and in every district, the defense contractors have invested in some defense work, so that if any program is canceled, it leads to unemployment in that particular district. And therefore, some Congress people or senators fight to keep certain defense programs ongoing, even though the military itself may not be asking for that particular program to continue. Over to you.
Absolutely. No, thank you for these excellent questions. I think it's a really interesting and important dynamic. Thinking about the military industrial complex and how, like, the influence of some of these large defense contractors in policymaking, especially in Congress, you know, it really depends on your perspective on these things. And I think it's not as straightforward as some people or organizations believe that it is. So on the one hand, it is certainly true that you have large, wealthy companies that are able to spend quite a bit of money on lobbying. You're absolutely right, Tariq. There is, you know, an issue where defense programs are spread throughout congressional districts, and so that creates an incentive for members of Congress to really fight to expand or preserve those programs. Sometimes that is in contradiction to what the military actually wants, and sometimes it's not. But, you know, it's not as cut and dry as, you know, oh, the military industrial complex is leading US security policy by the hand. I think it's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation. So we do have defense requirements, and we do have requirements to make and purchase certain types of weapons in order to meet our military posture. And so, you know, it is not only that policy is being pushed from the industrial side, policy is also being pulled along from people who are really smart analysts who, you know, spend a lot of time thinking about this. So, you know, I kind of chafe at the idea that members of Congress are simply listening uncritically to defense contractors when it comes to some of these policy decisions. Certainly, defense contractors have a loud voice in Congress, and they do, you know, they're able to get a lot of meetings. They're able to kind of buy their way into certain situations. And so, you know, build up those relationships with people who are in decision-making positions. But I think there's also a lot of kind of critical thought that goes into the actual, especially when it comes to the Appropriations Committee, there's a lot of critical thought that goes into which priorities are funded and why. And so, you know, it's not only that Lockheed Martin has convinced someone that we need a certain capability, it is also that, you know, that's going hand in hand with other strategic decisions.
Mm-hmm. So just to follow up before other questions come up, I'm not saying this is necessarily true, but it's sort of reported in the write-ups that in some cases, senior Defense Department officials who are responsible for certain big procurement programs, when they retire, they get senior positions on the boards of certain big companies. And one example that was pointed out some years ago was somebody who approved the purchase of gas masks or whatever, and then they went and joined that company. So on the generic issue, without getting into specific personalities or companies, these criticisms, do you think are warranted or maybe exaggerated from your point of view?
That's an excellent question, and that's definitely a kind of growing debate in the United States these days. It's absolutely true that there are senior defense officials who end up leaving government and then going to work in, senior, highly paid positions at some of these private companies. It's hard for me to say whether or not it's because, because of their previous position or whether there's some kind of impropriety going on. For the most part, I think people are following the rules. It's just that our rules are quite lenient in that regard. And so there are some activists and some politicians who are working very hard to change that and place more restrictions on what you can do after you leave government. Personally, I think that's a good idea. I think even if there isn't impropriety going on, just the perception that there is can be really detrimental to policy choices that we may want to make. And so it can call a lot of things into question. And I think it would be a bit simpler if we could just eliminate that as a possibility.
Thank you. So I would encourage participants to take advantage of Abigail's presence here to ask her questions.
We have in fact two questions. One by Sylvia, but before that, one post again by Cherry, who is joining us from South Africa, and she is asking if the policies that you've outlined are similar also for other countries. So American legislation would be usable as a reference how other countries could approach this topic in a similar way.
Yeah, so I would say I would think about it in terms of the types of committees and types of stakeholders that exist in the United States also exist in other countries that have nuclear capabilities. And so if you're interested in thinking through what the interests are at play and who the decision makers are, it can be a helpful reference to think through this, as an example. But every country is different and every country works a bit differently. So, the United States has three branches of government. Our government works a specific way. We have certain procedures in place, and that's very different from some place with like a parliamentary government where it works differently. So I would say, certainly don't look at US nuclear policy as a reference guide for what is, Russian nuclear policy or British nuclear policy, because there are key differences between all of these. But I think where it can be helpful is understanding what are the departments, who are the decision makers, what do they need and want, and where do you find information about their positions. So I hope that my presentation is applicable to other countries in that regard. But I would say that the actual policy goals and objectives are not necessarily reflected across all nuclear countries.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then Sylvia, do you want to pose the question directly?
Yeah, sure, I can do that. Hi, Abigail. I'm sorry I'm not joining on video. I'm quickly preparing my lunch, but thanks for a great presentation. I thought it was very insightful. I definitely learned a lot from the great great information that you provided in a very succinct and cogent manner. My question is, and especially in the backdrop of a lot of discussion and churning on sole authority and the no first use policy in the anticipation of the Biden-Harris administration's nuclear posture review, can you briefly explain the interagency process of the NPR, and also, according to you and in your perspective, what really shapes the contours of NPR? Is it the response to a strategic and evolving geopolitical environment, or is it more of a specific administration's orientation and response to the global nuclear order as a whole? I'll stop there and thanks once again.
Abigail, you might also explain to the participants what is meant by sole authority. Thanks.
Absolutely. No, thank you very much, Sylvia, for that question. It's a great one. I will preface this by saying that I have not worked in the federal government, and I don't currently work in the federal government. So I can share a bit about the process from what I've read and what I've heard. But this is not firsthand information, and it's certainly not, breaking news that I'm sharing today. So thinking about, well, why don't I define a few terms first? So thinking about the Nuclear Posture Review, this is really one of the key guiding documents that comes out of the Department of Defense in consultation with other federal agencies and the president, defining what the role of nuclear weapons is in US policy, and really explaining, why we have nuclear weapons, what we use them to deter, how they're postured, to the extent that you can in an unclassified manner when you're reading that unclassified summary. And then, of course, there's a much bigger classified document that we don't get to see. And then sole authority means the authority to actually launch nuclear weapons. So in the United States, and this is not necessarily true in all nuclear armed countries, but in the United States, it is only the president who has the authority to launch nuclear weapons. And so in order to launch nuclear weapons has to come from the president. It is verified in several different ways. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, să cam termin acum.
I think it's Christian's microphone. If you could switch himself to mute, please.
I thought someone had a question. Anyway, and so there have been some policy debates and discussions in the United States about whether that's a good idea, or whether there are risks with that system that should be changed. And so thinking about, the current nuclear posture review process, this is something that's ongoing now. So we have not yet seen the nuclear posture review. In terms of the interagency process, I kind of talked through some of the agencies that have equities in the nuclear environment, the nuclear system. And really, I think each of those have a role in the nuclear posture review. It really is driven typically by the Department of Defense. And then the document is also, gets contributions from Department of State, from Department of Energy, from people who work on very specific topics like arms control verification and things like that. And then, it's reviewed by all of the agencies together to get as close to consensus as you can with all of those stakeholders at play. And sometimes the interests don't always align perfectly. And then ultimately, it is kind of top leadership who would sign off on that document. So I believe, as far as I know, that is what the process looks like. Again, I've never been involved with it. So my understanding comes from reading, reporting about that process and talking to people who have been involved in that process. And Sylvia, you asked, to what extent does the strategic environment determine the contours of the NPR versus the orientation of a specific administration? I think it's really a combination. And when you think about all of these agencies that are contributing to the nuclear posture review, you have to remember that in the United States, they're made up of a combination of political appointees who their job is to represent the perspective of the administration, and civilians who are kind of permanent federal employees. And so they've been, sitting in the administration for a long time. So, apologize, I'm getting a phone call. There are lots of different perspectives and lots of different tensions that have to be worked out during that process. And I think it ends up being a bit of a compromise. So to an extent, you have the strategic environment kind of pushing nuclear policy in a certain direction, or forcing administrations to make certain decisions about what our nuclear policy should be. On the other hand, you might have kind of political appointees coming from the perspective of the administration. Maybe they have a really specific objective, such as implementing a no first use policy or doing away with sole authority that they would like to implement. And so, there's a bit of a negotiation process that happens there.
So just to remind participants to please keep yourself muted. So just to follow up on sole authority for the benefit of the participants, Abigail, it's been reported that in January of 2021, last year, General Milley, who's the chair of the Joint Chiefs in the US, ordered that, if President Trump were to give the order to launch nuclear missiles, he needs to be advised. But others pointed out that the president has the sole authority, as you mentioned, and nobody can countermand the president. So would you like to elaborate a little bit more on this, and that there is actually a chain of succession, that should the president be incapacitated, it's the vice president and then the secretary of state or the speaker of the house, I forget. Would you like to elaborate on that, or shall we move on to something else?
No, you're exactly right. That is how it would work if the president were incapacitated. With regards to the January of 2021 reporting, I think what we see there is what could have become a constitutional crisis. So, if you get to a point where a president makes an order to launch and you have senior military personnel trying to cut that off, I think if your position is that we should not have a no first use policy, or if your position is that that we should have sole authority, so we should have a single individual who's responsible for making decisions about nuclear weapons, that kind of undermines our credibility when it comes to deterrence. So, it's definitely a complicated issue, and I'm not prepared to argue one way or another about it at this moment, but I do think, that reporting was very troubling. Yeah.
Okay. So we're coming to the end of our time. So one final chance for participants to have their say. Alexander, are you seeing any raised hands or comments?
No, at the moment. I only hear in the chat there are a few thank you notes, and from Claire, please just say if you don't feel that you have too much to say on the topic. Do you see any places, topics, areas in US nuclear policy where non-Americans can be effective?
That's a good question. So I wonder what you mean by effective. So effective in changing US policy or effective in implementing US policy? I'm happy to speak a bit to either of those. So I think, ultimately there are plenty of international priorities that have to do with non-proliferation and arms control. And so really, especially in the non-proliferation space, kind of cooperating with, capacity building programs and things like that. So my organization, CRDF Global, we implement a lot of trainings for international partners, including for journalists often, on how to report on non-proliferation related topics or countering disinformation related to non-proliferation. So if you think about, several kind of crises of non-proliferation or issues that have undermined non-proliferation norms, those often go alongside massive state-based disinformation campaigns. So if you think about the attack on Sergei Skripal with Novichok, or the attack on Alexei Navalny, or the use of chemical weapons in Syria, of course, these are outside of the nuclear realm, so not quite atomic, but those are issues where we see a big need for greater involvement across all levels of society, across the international community. So I would say that is one big area where non-Americans could absolutely be effective.
Mm-hmm. Also, earlier in this webinar, we had two presenters, John Woolstall and also Jessica Cox from NATO, and they pointed out the pressures on US policymakers from allies to show that the US is still determined to protect them and is credibly involved. So it can work both ways, either to shape policy for disarmament or arms control, or to shape policy for strengthened defense. So we've come toward the end of our time. What, Alexander, did you have something?
No, that was it.
There are no further questions.
Okay, so I'll invite you for your final comments. I was reading somewhere that in the current crisis over Ukraine, some elements in the US now are asking for another $200 billion over the $778 billion already approved in the defense budget by, I think, the US Congress. Is that correct? And do you see any powerful forces asking for a further increase in the US defense budget, and any other closing comments you might have?
Yeah, thank you. I'm not familiar with the specifics with regards to the budget request over Ukraine, so I can't really speak to that. But thank you so much for having me. It really has been a pleasure sharing a bit about the US policymaking process and how it relates to nuclear policy with you all. I do hope that it was helpful, and please don't hesitate to reach out if anyone has any further questions or if I can be helpful in the future. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Abigail, and thank you for taking the time to discuss these issues with us. And I hand back to Peter and to Claudia.
I'm going to defer to Claudia, but thank all the participants for joining this briefing. We will inform you as soon as possible about the date of the next briefing. Please let us have the doodles if you've not already completed them, and also the EdApps. I think there are some outstanding EdApp assignments that need to be completed. And with that, I'm gonna hand it over to Claudia, and see you soon.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. For me, it's just a couple of words of thanks. First of all, to Tariq, you were really brave as ever for so long time to moderate this seminar, very professional and showing us your deep knowledge about all the things and what has to do with nuclear. So thank you for this. From Adenauer Foundation, again, thank you to Atomic Reporter for bringing such interesting group of speakers together.